Hey there. Tonight, desert trails and highland shrine, as Yahweh rises from storms to solitary rule. Who first spoke the name beneath moving tent? How did a mountain god outgrow his mountain? Before you get too cozy, if this kind of quiet storytelling helps you drift off, you can tap like and subscribe without lifting your head from the pillow. While you're there, tell me the city you're listening from and what time it is. I'm always curious how late you're keeping me company. Now dim the lights. Let a small fan add that gentle hush. Soften your breathing, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. Settle in. We'll begin where thunder once crowned the highlands. The canvas opens on a road of dust and salt, where caravans move like patient constellations along the edges of desolate plateaus. Tents rise at dusk, pegged into earth still warm from the day, and fires make small, deliberate suns. In this nocturnal hush, the world feels older, more legible, somewhere beyond the circle of light. Thunder rolls between dark ridges, and the wind carries the clean, metallic scent that announces rain that may not arrive. Voices lower as if the storm itself could overhear. A name travels from mouth to mouth, half prayer, half password. It is a name carried more than carved, breathed more than built. A name that belongs to people who sleep under canvas and keep their gods portable. The ancient Near East is loud with divinity. Coastal towns raise songs to storm lords who rake the sea with tridents of lightning and tame the wet chaos so ships can find harbor. River capitals bow before sky fathers enthroned above, stepped temple, their laws descending along the brick courses of ziggurats that rise like man-made hills. Every valley and grove hosts a shrine and a local protector. Every spring has a tongue. In this crowded society of the sacred, there is room and rivalry for many powers. Kings need gods who make rain on command. Scribes need gods who keep the ledger of fate. Shepherds need gods who walk when they walk. It is not a question of whether the divine is present. It's a question of whose presence you trust when the horizon darkens. Our path tonight is narrow at first, a track south and east, toward the rough country where copper mines bite the rock and goat bells measure the hours. Here, worship prefers stones. One can stack quickly, and altars one can fold away, charred by the same fires that cook the bread. The God who matters in this terrain knows dust, drink, and wind. He speaks in the grammar of storm. Cloud is chariot, thunder is voice, lightning is arm. He does not yet demand temples broad enough to humble a city. He is recognized by the sudden cold of shade under a passing cloud and the law-like terror that follows a strike. Offerings are simple. Promises are simpler. If we reach the next well, if our herds deliver calves, if our children survive this fever, the night listens. Imagine, for a moment, the micro-world of a single camp. A boy, his hair still damp from washing, keeps watch where the date palm logs are smoldering. His mother lifts a leather curtain to check on the newborn. The father, anxious about tomorrow's path, steps beyond the ring of firelight to read the sky's edges. When thunder speaks, it does not need translation. The boy remembers stories of a mountain where the voice was clear, a mountain crowned with smoke that smelled like new earth after rain. The father says the name in a whisper, as if too much volume might turn awe into presumption. A god of storms is near, but he is not only weather. He is the one who makes a way in impassable country, who binds families by oath and neighbors by justice, who teaches that gratitude is best expressed in how you treat the vulnerable when the winds drop. In a world of competing heavens, why would one name begin to gather the attributes that many had scattered? Part of the answer lives in simple experience. People learn which prayers feel answered and which promises cohere. When you move off it, you prize what can move with you both tools and truth. A deity who travels, who does not need a house of cedar to hear or be heard, feels honest to those who live by horizon and weather. Another part of the answer comes from crisis, the kind that rearranges loyalty. Drought, war, exile each strips away gods who functioned only when harvests were good and borders were quiet. What remains is the one who speaks above storms, more mysteriously. Inside silent, still, we move carefully. Scholars argue about where the name was first spoken with intent and continuity, and arguments have their own storms. Some point to inscriptions that flicker like fire in a distant cave. Suggestions of a people for whom this god was not an abstraction, but a traveling presence. Others hear the resonance of older titles most high, Almighty settling onto this particular name, like cloaks exchanged at dawn. Tonight we will not force conclusions. Instead, we'll follow memory as it is carried, on leather, on lips, in small customs that outlast monuments. We will watch a storm god become a lawgiver, and then the axis of a people's conscience, not by erasing the old images, but by melting and pouring them into a new mold. Think of the tent itself. Poles lashed, ropes taut, skin tight enough to sing when the wind leans on it. A tent is a lesson in covenant. Every part depends on every other. If one knot fail, the whole room opens to the night. In such spaces, promises matter. To break faith is literally to invite the desert in. It is no surprise that a God honored here speaks in bonds and oaths. I will be with you. You will be my people. The thunder that once simply frightened becomes the punctuation of vows. Lightning, which once flashed and vanished, becomes an image for guidance, bright and brief, enough to take the next step. The storm that once proved raw power begins to reveal a character, not only the God who can, but the God who will in keeping with a word given. Beyond the highlands, cities continue their festivals. Priests measure grain, and temple roofs glitter. Their gods are magnificent, and their claim to order is strong. Yet magnificence can be brittle when empires grind against each other. Sculptures lose noses, inscriptions chip, and pyramids become backgrounds for the impatient sky. Out here, with only a tent to fall on you and a field of stars to insist you are small, the sacred seeks other registers. It speaks through fairness in trade at a lonely well, through restraint when anger would be easy, through care for a stranger's donkey who has stumbled. These small laws, carried like tools, begin to define the worshiper more than the weather does. A storm can frighten anyone into a vow. Only a path teaches you to keep it. So we begin with thunder in the distance and a calm fire near at hand. With many gods on the coasts and one name in the highlands. With a people who are learning that holiness can travel, that the divine does not need a fixed address to be faithful. The name remains soft on the tongue tonight. We are not yet at the point where mountains crack and nations listen. We are at the beginning, where awe rises with the wind, and the first grammar of this God is the sky. Voice in the cloud, presence in the pillar, judgment in the flash, mercy in the rain that finally arrive. Later, as our story moves, we will see this God step out of the weather and into words, into commandments that braid justice with memory, into songs that retell storms as parables, into reforms that pull people from scattered hills toward a single center. We will pass through rival altars and rural shrine, through kings who tighten and loosen the bonds, through catastrophes that do not erase the name, but cleanse it of its narrower meanings. We will listen as poets turn old storm titles into ethical light, as prophets take thunder and translate it into a plea for the poor. In the end, the God who first felt like weather will become, for many, the one beneath whom weather itself is only one more creature. For now, let the tent cloth breathe, in and out, beating time with your own chest. Hear the low, rolling talk of the highlands as they speak in thunder to one another. Somewhere a goat shifts. Somewhere a pot gives a tiny sigh as it settles in ash. If sleep come, let it. The voice will be waiting in the next part, still a storm, but already more than storm ready to lead us from the edge of the wilderness toward a grammar sturdy enough to hold a people through droughts, empire, and the long, long night. The road descends from the highlands to the river plains, and the air changes character. Dust gives way to humidity that clings to the skin, and the horizon becomes an argument between reeds and sky. Here the gods do not travel, they reign from addresses. Step temples rise, tier by tier, bricks sun-dried and stamped, their faces painted with colors that refuse to fade. The stairways climb like thoughts returning to their source. And at the top, where priests attend to bread, oil, and incense, you can feel why a people would imagine heaven as a house with good order when you come from tents that must be tied and retied. A God who dwells in something as patient as fired clay is an aspiration. In rooms below the roof, a different holiness speaks thins, wedge-shaped and numerous. Clay tablets dry on shelves like loaves. Scribes bow over wet rectangle, cutting language with a stylus until names and numbers begin to hold a city together. Lists of offerings, canals measured, wages tallied, stars observed. The city thinks with a reed in its hand. Stories are copied, too, of a council of great ones whose voices decide fates, of a sky father whose authority balances storm lords, who wrestle with seas that remember chaos. The elders recite myths beside the river, while children poke at fish with sticks. The sacred is not a sudden wind. It is administration, ritual, a calendar precise enough to trust with planting. Listen to one such story as it might have been told on a festival night. The courtyard is crowded with garlands and smoke. Drums beat like a steady heart. A priest half sings, half declaims the tale of a god who tames the water, who builds with victory. A platform for kingship. Overhead, lightning is a rumor. The real thunder is the crowd's answer when the name of the temple's patron is called, when the final line is chanted, when the god receives the emblems of destiny that authorize rule. The audience breathes as one. Tomorrow the canals will be opened according to schedule, and the ordinary miracle of water will walk the fields. Good order is theology in motion. The world these plains imagine is a council chamber. Even power has minutes taken. Sky Father presides. Stormlord argues. Scribal deities keep the ledger of stars and outcomes. Lesser beings run errands between heaven and earth. Kings are children of this order not by blood, perhaps, but by favor. Their right to rule echoes the god's right to speak. In such a cosmos, the sea is never simply water. It is memory of what cannot be ruled forever. Every year, the gods must renew their victory over it so that grain will rise again. Processions reenact the old combat as reassurance. Chaos bow. Order returns. Walk the stairway of a ziggurat at dawn. The bricks are cool under your feet. At each landing, wind tastes different. More sky, less city. At the summit, you find a small room with a bed and a table, furnishings into which presence can be invited. Priests move with practiced intimacy, a choreography of care. The city below murmurs, markets opening, donkeys stamping, vendors testing their voices. Up here, the scale feels right. A house for heaven that watches a house for earth. If you were to pray here, you might think less of storms and more of schedule, less of sudden rescue and more of constancy. The God who smiles on such a place smiles on symmetry, pledge, and repetition. Yet even here, the storm refuses to be domesticated entirely. Sky Father delegates, but the Storm Lord dramatizes. When rains delay, prayers lean more urgently toward thunder. When lightning strikes the far plain, gossip visits every doorway. Power that can crack the horizon in a breath becomes irresistible in liturgy. It is not hard to see why. Across the region, the titles that fasten to king's might, rider of clouds, breaker of enemies, belong first to those who command weather. A harvest is a vote, and rain swings elections. If you read the tablets quietly, you meet another persistent memory, a flood that reset everything. The story changes its name, but the shape is familiar warning. Arca, bird, mountain, covenant of some kind, whether told to teach humility or to explain a layer of silt that puzzled farmers. The flood narrative suggests that the council's decisions, though just, can be devastating. Survival, then, must be secured by obedience and favor. For a people listening on a riverbank, the moral is clear. Keep the God's order and the waters will know their bounds. For listeners from the highlands, another thought might stir. Perhaps the God who truly rules is the one who keeps promise after catastrophe, who binds himself to mercy as tightly as to judgment. The city's language for the divine is careful and plural. The tense is immediate and singular, but the two worlds are not sealed off from each other. Merchants carry words with goods, and titles stick to names as surely as dust sticks to ankles. A man who has offered incense on a tower may later share a well with pastoralists and tell, with contagious authority, of a God who rides the storm like a king. A woman who has bartered at a canal gate may sit in the shade of a highland acacia and describe the rhythm of festivals where gods decide the year's fate. In these exchanges, templates travel. The notion of a divine council, a victory over sea chaos, of the storm. As royal proclamation, these become part of a shared dictionary into which any people might write their own story. Somewhere in this shared dictionary, a name from the highlands begins to draw bold lines around itself. Its worshippers do not reject the words their neighbors use. They inherit them and reshape them. A cloud can still be a chariot, lightning a weapon. A voice, the roar that unseats tyrants, but slowly, so slowly, you would miss it. If you measured only in king's reigns, the imagery tilts. The storm ceases to be merely the theater of a tempest god. and becomes an instrument in the hands of one whose will is not weather's slave. The council becomes less a meeting of peers and more a court with a single judge. The tablets of destiny are reduced to metaphor because destiny belongs to a speaker, not to an object. It is not that the old pictures are thrown away. They are melted down and recast to say something tighter, kindred, more demanded. Return for a moment to the scriptorium. A young scribe copies a hymn that praises a god as rider on the cloud. He pauses, rolls his shoulders, and stares out toward the river, where a thin mist burns away. The phrase is older than his grandfather, older than the bricks he sits upon. It is a phrase that will outlive his city, because it speaks to how humans hear power. If voice comes from the sky, it must be weighty. If the clouds answer, the answer must matter. He does not know that generations hence, hearers with other names for the same fear and hope will take the phrase and let it point to a deity who refuses to share rule. Not out of insecurity, but because justice requires a single standard. Festivals end, garlands wilt, clay cracks and break, and in a century or 5, the proud stairway becomes a hill that farmers avoid because sherds blunt their plowshares. But the template survives relocation, the way a melody can be carried without instruments. Skyfather, Stormlord, Council, Decree, victory over chaos, covenant after flood. Someone in a highland camp will hum that melody and find new words for it. Someone by a fire will send, "Our God speaks with thunder," but his favorite language is promise. He does not only tame seas, he tells us how to treat the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, and he judges us by it, and the others will nod. Pleased by the way a song meant for a city can be sung under canvas. When sleep begins to gather at the edges of your thoughts, let this be the part you key in. Civilization can make holiness look like architecture and arithmetic, and the desert can make holiness look like weather and vow. Both are true enough to teach. Neither is complete enough to be final. The God whose story we are following will take the stairway's order and the storm's immediacy, in time, claim them as metaphors more than as residences. He will descend from thunder to conscience without losing the sky, and he will step from council chamber to covenant table without losing authority. The old titles will remain, but their meanings will tilt like a sail finding a steadier wind. Outside, the reeds along the river make their small applause. A barge slides by, stacked with grain that will keep a city calm. The first star appears, a pin in the dusk. Somewhere upriver, a distant flash remarks on the horizon, and the delay before the thunder is long enough to count to 11. It is a good night for order and a good night for awe. Close your eyes if you like. We will climb one more stair and then return to the tents, where a name will begin to gather all this inheritance into itself, until what was many becomes one without becoming less. Coastlines break the straight edge of the sea into coves and promontories, and the wind that reaches them is braided, salt, resin, and a sweetness from crushed laurel. The settlements here face the water like theater seats, and their stages are altars open to the sky. On evenings when the west glows metal bright, the priests of the storm gather on heights above the harbors and raise their hands toward clouds that wrinkle like muscles under a pelt. The people watch with a practiced hopefulness. Fishing ropes have their patience. Olive trees have their patience. Rain has none. A God who can make the sky cooperate is a God worth following. Names populate this shoreline like shells. At the top of one pantheon stands El, an old word with the softness of age in it, imaged as a kindly enthroned father who presides rather than perform. Around him move others who act, a stormbringer whose flashes nail enemies to the ground, a sea who would be king if only it could be bound, a death that gulps the seasons and releases them, grudgingly on schedule. The stories from tablets found in the earth a little to the north, fragments, damage, sufficient tell of a council that debate, of tempests that settle disputes, of a rider upon the clouds whose victory ushers peace and harvest. There is swagger in these poems, a musical certainty that power should look like lightning drawn to the hand. Stand, if you can, in the mind of a coastal farmer at such a festival. You have cut terraces into the hillside with more faith than geometry. Your vines need the right balance of sun and storm. You have watched a single hard squall ruin a year, and a gentle week of rain redeem it. When the priest names the cloud rider, the title makes visceral sense. You cannot place your hope in a God who smiles politely. while the sea takes your boat. You require a defender whose voice carries to the horizon and whose spear, thrown from the dart, never misses. The rituals explain the world and rehearse it. In one hymn, the god of storm grapples with the sea. The sea is not only water, but the memory of chaos, the unruled surge that wants no bank, no boundary, no beds for reeds. The storm lord defeats it not to end it, for no fisherman desires a dead sea, but to teach it a walk that feeds towns without drowning them. The victory secures kingship. The king who sits beneath this liturgy becomes, in miniature, what the god is in vastness, the one who tells power where to go and when to stop. The social fabric is woven with weather at the loom, but councils with many voices breed rivalries, and temples with many patrons breed choices. If one divinity holds the thunder, and another holds the grain, and another the gate to the underworld, worship becomes a portfolio, prudently diversified. Households keep figurines in pairs. A traveling man, returning, finds his wife has added a charm for a child's fever to the lintel, not because she has ceased to honor the cloud rider, but because no household can afford a specialist who refuses consultation. Here, devotion is practical, elastic, and proximate. Into this world of shared titles and layered allegiances, another name is spoken by visitors from the hills and wadis. They know, too, the gray wall advancing across the sea, the way the water darkens under it, and the gulls grow suddenly philosophical. They have their own stories about a god whose voice takes shape as weather, who rides without saddle on the massing cloud, whose approach is described in sounds before words, and yet, placed beside the coastal epic, their telling tilts, where the poem's thunder announces a divine duel, won so that a monarch might receive his seat. The Highland version increasingly points not to kingship as spectacle, but to justice as command. The same lightning that elsewhere nails enemies becomes, here, a light by which a traveler reads the path's next turn. The same roar that crowns a god in a council chamber becomes, here, a sentence that begins, "You shall." This is not rejection. It is transposition. Titles like "Rider on the Clouds" move from one staff to another and keep their melody. The instrument, however, changes less. Bronze bat, more taut skin over wood. A people who have learned to measure holiness by oaths, kept at wells, and by restraint shown when anger is easy, begin to hear the storm's grammar as moral rather than merely martial. The sea is still chaos, but chaos now live, too, in unfair weights, in bribes slipped like coins into quiet hands. In a neighbor's field boundary, move 2 cubits in the night. The old combat with the sea must be reenacted. Yes, but it can be reenacted when a judge refuses a gift. A story from a coastal port, told in a different key. A procession climbs the hill, carrying a carved staff crowned with a small, hammered disc. Sun caught in it. The god's image is not carried, perhaps too holy, perhaps unnecessary. The title is carried instead, midway. Clouds bruise the western sky. A wind hushes everyone at once. The priest sings the line about the rider upon the cloud. Children, hearing the adults quiet, clutch their reed dolls closer. At the summit, the first cold drops fall, coin large. The crowd does not panic. It exhales, like a field after plow. Dignitaries nod to each other, rehearsing the connection between right and rain. Down in the market, awnings slap their greetings to the gusts. When the storm has passed, the talk will turn inevitably to which god favored which household, to who promised what at which shrine. Portfolios will be adjusted. In a hill village, almost the same scene unfolds but ends differently. The storm breaks over a ravine where goats stand, idiotic and serene. A shepherd throws his cloak over a newborn kid and leans his back into the rain to make a small cave. He does not sing. He speaks a name, soft and fast, a syllable that has become a habit. When the flash comes, he counts without meaning to. At 8, he hears the thunder, and relief works like warmth under wet wool. Later, by the fire, he will repeat a short story about a god who came from a mountain with a voice that was not just noise, who bound a people to himself with obligations as firm as rock. He will say that the storm proves power, but the covenant proves character, and in a room full of people whose walls can be rolled up in an hour. That sentence will draw heads up between port and village. Exchange continue. Traders carry oil and words, cedar and phrases. A potter in the highlands begins to scratch on a jar. A title once sung beside the sea. A poet in a coastal town borrowed from a visiting elder. A grave way of speaking about promise. The lexicon thickens, where one heard counsel. Another hears court, where one saw throne. Another sees stone of witness. Amid these borrowings, the name from the wilderness refuses to remain merely one among similar figures. Whatever can be shared with neighbors is shared. What cannot be shared is quietly insisted upon. The divine counts as an image, is not denied, but its membership thins. The sea is still an opponent, but it is an opponent like lies and theft are opponents. Victory looks like rain in the right week, and also like a fair measure in the market, when no one is watching. Scholars, centuries later, would argue colorfully about whether titles moving from one cult to another implies dependence, or simply a shared sky. The faithful on the ground had less dramatic interests. Which prayer to teach a child? Which oath to refuse on a complicated day? Which festival to attend when loyalties tug? The storms themselves did not care what name they answered to. They rolled in answer to pressure and temperature, not incense and drum. Yet the human heart, hearing thunder, answered with metaphors that shaped markets and marriages. To call a god cloud rider is to admit what frightens you, and to hope in who can negotiate with it. To keep calling that same God keeper of promise as harvests fail and succeed is to admit what forms you, and to trust that power is not only spectacle. On a late summer night, when the sea holds heat, even after the sun is conceded, the air becomes heavy with the intention of weather. Lamps burn under porticos. Laughter tilts out of doorways. Smoke rises from altars where fat cracks and flare. At a distance, a line of lightning fingers the horizon, like someone turning pages too quickly. The priests will climb the hill. The shepherds will pull their cloaks close to their throats. A mother will move her sleeping child inland from the doorway and whisper a name as she does. Under so many acts, one intuition gathers mass. If order is to bind more deeply than the spectacle can entertain, the storm must become more than theater. It must become law translated into mercy, power translated into patience, victory translated into care for those who cannot repay. By morning, the streets shine clean. Salt rinse. A gull pecks at something with bureaucratic persistence. Fishermen cast the first net of the day, and the floats stitch a brief seam on the water before the weights persuade it under. Far inland, a wadi that has not carried water in weeks murmurs to itself, remembering. In both places, the same conclusion forms without announcement. Thunder is impressive, but goodness is what lasts. We will carry this conclusion with us as we leave the coast. Inland again. The terrain buckles and lifts. Paths coil upward, and the air grows articulate with stone. There, in hill towns where courtyards smell of lentils and crushed mint, where elders sit with walking sticks that have learned the conversations of years, the name from tents and storms will enter sentences about justice and memory. The council will not so much be denied as reduced to a grammar exercise for schoolboys. The God will not so much be made new as shown to have always intended more than weather. And in that shift, slow as erosion, quick as a vow, many gods become one without becoming poor. Close your eyes if you're ready. The sea has taught what it could. The clouds have framed their lessons. The road bends inland now, where a different kind of thunder waits in prophets' voices and in the long patience of those who keep their word. Patterns emerge when you let stories sit beside each other long enough. The names change, but the gestures rhyme. A sky father who presides while others perform. A storm lord whose voice is weather and whose weapon is light. A council where decrees are spoken, where destinies are tallied, where victory over sea chaos renews the world. A covenant or promise that tethers the next season to the last. From the river plains to the maritime heights, from terrace to pasture. The grammar repeats with local accents. The mind, especially at night, when it has time to be honest, notices. Perhaps heaven is pictured as a palace, because palaces are what we know of order. Perhaps the cloud is a chariot, because only a chariot moves with the freedom and speed of that white animal pouring over the ridge. Perhaps thunder is voice, because we have learned that important words must be loud enough to stop a harvest of wrongs once it has begun. Let us place the phrases on a quiet table and see how they sit together. Rider on the clouds, voice over the water, breaker of the deep, most high, Holy One, Lord of hosts. They are not unique stamps. They are coins traded across borders, worn at the edges by use, yet still heavy with value. In harbor hymns, The rider's victory means grain for markets and a king secure on his throne. In river liturgies, the voice over the waters means canals filled on schedule. A calendar that holds, in the highlands, those same words curled tighter around conscience. The rider's victory becomes a people learning to say no to bribes. The voice over the waters becomes a sentence that lifts the poor out of the floodplain of neglect. The vocabulary shared by neighbors is not a chain. It is a toolbox. Each people reach for the tool they need, and the shape of the handle changes to fit the hand. When titles travel, they bring expectations with them. A worshiper who calls any god the cloud rider expects effectiveness, rain when rain is due, drought broken, enemy campfires blown to ash. But if that title is entrusted to a deity who is already speaking in covenants, the expectation widens. Effectiveness becomes faithfulness. The storm's suddenness becomes steadiness in law. The flash that cuts night becomes the small, guiding light of daily restraint. Pay your worker by sundown. Do not tilt your scale. Make room in your field's corners for those who walk it in hunger. The cloud rider who becomes keeper of promise does not lose the sky. He organizes it around the neighbor. Consider, for a moment, the council. Across the region, divinities gather in ordered speech. Some propose, some oppose, some execute errands that scratch the earth into compliance with heaven's plan. The picture makes sense in cities where committees turn desire into irrigation schedules. But what happens when a people accustomed to tents takes that picture in on? They do not deny it outright. They thin it. The council is not a parliament of peers, but a court with a single source of verdict. Lesser beings remain messengers, guardians. Winds with names, but their authority is function, not sovereignty. The drama moves from competition to clarity. One will is sufficient to name what is good. Many hands may carry the message. Only one hand writes the terms. The sea, too, is worth watching as it changes rooms. In coastal poems, it stands as the great opponent, the restless not yet that wants to swallow boundaries and kings alike. It must be made to kneel each year so that vineyards can ascend their proper hills. When the motif climbs inland, the sea keeps its menace, but loses its monopoly on chaos. Disorder becomes as present in human systems as in weather. The flood that ruins fields has a brother in the bribe that ruins courts. The battle with the sea becomes a parable about choosing fairness when secrecy would pay better. It is not that the myth is discarded, it is moralized. A long word that simply means turn toward the heart. Under these shifts, the name we are tracing gains weight. It inherits the region's gold images that shine because they have been polished by many hands and hammers them into a new shape without wasting the metal. Storm remains storm, but it is now servant. Council remains council, but it is now theater for a single judge. Victory remains victory, but it is now evaluated by the widow's mouthful, the orphan's cloak, the stranger's restful night. The words do not shout less. They sing differently. We should be careful, though, in the dark. Not to mistake resemblance for copying. People share skies and problems. Metaphors are limited and generous at once. It is not necessary to trace a dotted line of borrowing for every title. It may be enough to admit that humans name power with what frightens and feeds them thunder and rain, law and harvest, and that neighbors who trade bread also trade speech. If a phrase begins on the coast and ends in the hills, the wind may have carried it. Or perhaps both heard it from the same storm. The discipline is in listening to how the phrase is used once adopted. There is doctrine in the direction of a metaphor. Let's try a small exercise. Imagine a hymn sung beside a mountain ravine after the first autumn rain has restored the path's grip and the smell of wet stone is like new ink. The singer uses lines any coastal listener would recognize. He rides upon the cloud, his voice over the waters. He splits the deep and treads upon the heights. A trader visiting from the port nods, thinking of old festivals. But the verses do not end with enthronement. They turn, almost invisibly, toward housekeeping. He loves justice more than sacrifice. He hears the crushed and the quiet. He binds the cruel in their own cord. The cloud rider is still Gloria, but Glory has learned the language of ethic. A poem that would have once finished with a crown now finishes with a scale level and honest. In a scribe's room, another small change is recorded, where an older line might have spoken of the gods' council delivering decrees in chorus. A newer line preserves the council, but changes the acoustics. The others attend, one speaks. A messenger departs, not with a compromise, but with a verdict. The room does not feel tense in the old way. It feels certain. In a world exhausted by the shuffle of many minor thrones, the simplicity is a relief. Simplicity, however, is demanded. If there is one will that names good and evil, then cleverness cannot rescue wrongdoing. You cannot please one God with offerings while cheating another with weights. The one who rides the storm knows the cupboard and the court. Outside, life continues. Plow lines straighten under winter clouds. Ships nose into coves with their serious patience. A child traces on a soft shard of clay the sign for water, then for light, then for a name she has heard the elders whisper at dusk. The syllables hard to write because they are more breath than ink. She does not know counsels or comparative myth. She knows the feel of a just decision when her brother apologizes and returns what he took. She knows the relief in her mother's voice when the rain came in time. If asked, she would call the one who arranges such things both cloud rider and promise keeper, and see no contradiction. In her world, words have neighbors the way houses do. As night builds, the pattern resolves enough for sleep to work on it. The images, we have noticed, will travel with us to the next turn of the road, where we will meet a region of rougher rock and sharper light. A people whose tents sit in the shadow of mountains named in old poems. A name written perhaps in the dust before it was written in ink. There, the storm's titles sound less like spectacle and more like identity. A voice that once roared from sky will be said to have spoken from fire and cloud on a height that wore thunder like a crown. A covenant will be offered, not as a portfolio edition, but as one way of life. And the grammar of the region, the cloud, the sea, the council will be pressed patiently into a single sentence that holds a people together when palaces fall and stones remember the better rooms they once were. Close your eyes. Let the old phrases drift and reorder themselves. Rider on the clouds, most high, voice over water, breaker of the deep, keeper of promise. Hear how they stop competing and start agreeing, like instruments tuning to the same note. The storm goes on, as storms will, but the music it plays now is not only awe. It is instruction. In that music, we will soon hear footsteps on a mountain path, and the hush that falls when a crowd realizes that the weather is no longer the loudest thing in the world. The road tilts south into harsher country, where the maps thin out and the sky seems to lean closer to the earth. Here the mountains are not grand enough to be temples, and not gentle enough to be farms. They are work-broken shoulders of rock that hold the day's heat until midnight and then surrender it all at once, as if the sun were a debt collector. Wadis, dry most months. Remember how to be rivers after a single hour of honest rain? The air has a metallic edge from the copper veins exposed by wind and time. Travelers who choose these routes do so because the coast is watched. The plain is taxed, and the wilderness, for all its risk, keeps fewer ledgers. Night in this land begins without ceremony. The light fails, as if someone has blown out a lamp cupped in their hands. Tents go up quickly, goat hair, dark and deliberate, pitched low so the wind can finger them without tearing. Fires are small, mostly for tea and the dignity of warmth. There are shrines here, but they are the kind you can pack in a bag. A smooth stone marked by smoke, a copper pendant punched with a sign, a name that fits between teeth and tongue, like bread. If a god is real in such places, he must be able to walk, to wait, to speak without the help of stairways. In scraps of writing from the great kingdoms to the west, there are mentions thin as the margins they inhabit of people whom administrators call shesu, a word that likely meant wanderers, though wanderers often know exactly where they are going. Some notes seem to place them near Seir or Tema, in ground that shows its bones, or farther toward Midian, where the hills are acquainted with thorn and rumor. A few lines, dim with time, put a consonant cluster beside the shasu that later readers have tried to sound into a name, Yahweh, or something like it. The temptation to hear the later sacred name in this earlier breath is strong. The duty to be careful is stronger. What can be said is simple and sufficient. The wilderness was not empty of worship, and some who moved through it carried a syllable that mattered. Picture a copper camp at dawn. The bellies of the furnaces are red and unashamed, and the slag lies like cooled lightning where it was kicked aside. Men with faces dusted green-black from malachite turn their cups in their hands and watch the sky decide itself. A foreman checks the wind. A boy small enough to slip where men cannot, is reminded to keep his scarf over his mouth. An elder, whose job is to know the old routes between wells, rises last and walks beyond the circle of heat to greet the day. With a word so short it almost isn't a word at all. He says it, as you might say, here, not to mark a place, but to announce presence, yours and the one who hears. In such a world, storms are not entertainment. They are reasons to move or to stay, to close the tent's mouth or open, to set pots where they will catch the clean water that falls roof-edge to bowl. Thunder is not theater. It is logistics and, sometimes, law. When a voice is described as thunder here, it is not to make it grand, but to make it unmistakable. Lightning does not adorn a god. It announces a path. A cloud shadow traveling over a slope is not a metaphor for transience. It is the difference between a flock that climbs and one that dies. If a name gathers its first worshippers in such ground, it will tend toward verbs. Go, lead, guard, bind. Remember? Stories coil around name. One speaks of a mountain where the voice of this god was heard with a clarity that removed excuses. Fire was there, and smoke that smelled like new rain on old dust. The words people remember are simple and sharp. They do not tell cosmogonies or explain the habits of distant stars. They tell you what to do with your neighbor's ox if it wanders into your yard. They tell you about truth, time, parents, desire. They tie worship to behavior with such firmness that to unfasten one would tear the other. If you have lived with tents that depend on knots and pegs, this is not foreign philosophy. It is a familiar physic. Around that mountain, the god has companioned, in the sense that any great one has attendant. There are messengers and flames and things with wings because the imagination, when it tries to picture obedience moving quickly, draws feathers. But the mountain itself is the star. It wears thunder like a crown and ignorance like a fog that burns off as you approach. The presence that fills the place is not content to be visited and admired. It is interested in loyalty that looks like justice when the weather is ordinary. It speaks in command, not because command is a preferred tone, but because commands can be learned by heart and shared aloud, in fields and at wells, without a priest or a ladder. A shepherd from Midian tells a version of the story that begins not with fire, but with quiet attention paid to something burning without being consumed. An oddity turned into a summons. A miner from Timnah adds that the god knows copper's hunger and will not despise work that stains your hands. A trader from Edom says he heard the name in a storm that never arrived, but left its promise anyway, written in a cold wind that made men put on their cloaks. In all tellings, the mountain becomes less a location and more a lesson. Holiness does not need a city to coordinate it. The world's order can be learned in places that never knew order's architecture. We must admit the distance between our certainties and our wishes. The inscriptions are fragmentary. The geography is disputed. The lines between borrowed story and shared air are thin as a hair caught on a thorn. Some scholars argue with bright confidence that the name began here, in mouths chapped by this wind, ears trained by this silence. Others insist that the name is older than any one mountain and that what happened here was not invention, but concentration. The settling of many titles and hopes onto a single syllable ready to bear them. Tonight, we will keep both possibilities within reach and refuse to quarrel with sleep about them. Walk now, with a small caravan between ridges that hem the path like shoulders. A woman rides with her child swaddled against her, and the child dreams with the wide, unashamed mouth of the new. A man counts steps under his breath to mark the distance between waterskins. When they stop, they set 3 stones and lay a flat one across them and strike a fire that knows its business. Bread thins into something obedient to the hot stone. Dates remember the tree and forgive the journey when they eat. They do not thank weather or luck. They thank the one who made a path between 2 storms and a peace between 2 neighbors who would have preferred not to make one. The name is spoken softly, partly because that is piety, and partly because the night magnifies careless words. There is a small chest, well wrapped, that rides always in the shade side of a tent. Inside are things that matter for longer than a meal. A tool with a handle smoothed by a grandfather's hand, a scrap of leather cut with marks that are more tally than text, a stone that remembers a vow. When the chest is opened, and the stone is taken out and set upright, The camp's mood changes. Men sit with their backs a little straighter. The elder clears his throat. Someone speaks words about what was promised last time the stone stood, and what will be promised again. The god is not summoned by the stone. The people are. They stand around it the way a tent stands when its lines are true. In the morning, the stone lies down and becomes a thing for the bag again. But the promises remain vertical. In the copper camps, there is another scene. A dispute has grown stubborn. One man's donkey is taken to sympathy for another man's shade and cannot be persuaded by argument to leave. The owners bring the matter to the elder, who listens as if listening itself were a skill to be tested. He quotes a sentence that begins with, "You shall," and ends with an action that lowers the temperature of the day. Both men are dissatisfied evenly, which is the sign of fairness. They touch the pendant, stamped with the sign, and go about their work with less heat in their hands. That sentence, carried from mouth to mouth, does more to keep the peace than any spear. It would be clean to say that. From this land and these habits, monotheism rose like a star and never doubted itself again. The truth is more human. People love their shrines, their household gods, their charms sewn into children's clothes. They hedge their risk with amulets. The name spoken in this wilderness does not obliterate such things with a single shout. It persuades, it reforms, it sometimes rebukes and sometimes waits. It wins not only because it commands, but because its commands make life livable among people who would otherwise learn only the ethics of scarcity. Payback. The ethics taught here sound like mercy without softness and justice without spectacle. By the time caravans carrying these stories wander north and west into heavier histories, the name they carry has learned to walk through towns without losing its wilderness stride. It has learned to sit in courts without forgetting tents. It has learned to sound like thunder when the world needs interruption, and like a quiet vow when the world needs glue. It will keep the storm's titles without letting the storm tell it what to be. If sleep is near, let it find you with a simple image. A mountain outlined in lightning that never quite arrived. A tent breathing like a slow animal. A word so old it feels like breath more than speech. Whether that word first settled here or only passed through on its way to a wider work, it left footprints that match a people's steps. Portable, insistent, obedient to weather, but ruled by promise. In the next part, the name will begin to gather other names to itself. Old titles like cloaks against cold in the council rooms of cities will feel a draft, as windows opened in the highlands invite a different air. Names wear meanings, the way travelers wear cloaks layered, borrowed, exchanged when weather turns. As the caravans from the harsh south and the markets of the gentler north cross their threads, the sealable from the highlands begins to arrive in towns where older titles already have seats. There is El, a word with the gravity of age and the ease of everyday prayers. He has been called Most High in one hill, Almighty in another. He is imagined kind-eyed, the sort of father who presides with patience while younger. Brighter gods handle the commotion of storms and wars. There are shrines where people have spoken to El longer than anyone's memory can hold. There are stones that have heard those prayers so often that rain seems out of rote to fall softer on them. Into this established household, the name from the tents comes like a relative who resembles the family so closely that no one can decide whether to call him cousin or brother. The elders reach for the vocabulary they have, because new devotion dresses in familiar clothes first. El Most High sits easily beside the Highland name. El Almighty is spoken in the same breath as a syllable no mouth wants to misuse. A mother comforts a feverish child by invoking both without hearing contradiction. The divine counsel, as an image, remains on the wall, but the paintings are rearranged at night, and in the morning, a guest sits where the patriarch's chair once was. No one announces the change. Usage tilts until it seems always to have been so. An old man in a hill town, asked to bless a marriage, raises his hands and says, "May El Most High keep you." Then, almost without thinking, he adds the other name, the one from the desert, as if to seal the old with the new. Later he cannot say why. Perhaps he meant only to be thorough. Perhaps the blessing he learned as a boy has learned another sentence to sit beside it. In onomastic lists recorded by scribes who love order as much as piety, the shift can be traced in the way fathers name sons, some with El in the compound, some with a newer name, some with both. as if the household were keeping options open against the future. Names do their quiet work. They decide before doctrine has time to catch up. In homes, piety is practical. A family's shelf holds a lamp, a small jug, a terracotta figure that stands for safety in childbirth, a scrap of writing that someone said would keep the night from forgetting to end. There is a little jar for oil, and beside it a wooden plaque with scratched letters invoking El's kindness over the threshold. A visitor from farther south recognizes the invocation and, when no one is looking, adds a whispered syllable learned in wind. When the next child survives a fever that took others on the street, no one will be able to say whether oil or prayer or luck carried the night. Still, the new whisper will cling to the old plaque the way smoke clings to woven hair. Liturgists, who track words with the same attention merchants give weights, begin to notice that the titles are migrating. Most High, once a wide hat that could shelter any local sky father, narrows over a single brow. Almighty, which used to imply abundance, feels generous. Flocks multiplying comes to mean reliability, the one who keeps a promise past the convenience of keeping it. A shepherd's lullaby that once thanked El for the hill's sure path now thanks the one from the mountain for teaching feet to find it. It is not a riot, it is rearrangement. The palette stays the same. The painter turns the canvas toward a different light. Heard in the market, the shift is simply good sense. If El is Most High, someone says, he would not be offended to be known by the name of the one who proved himself in the wilderness. If the name from the storm is true, another says, it would be strange if he were not the same kindness our grandfathers addressed as El. Piety prefers coherence to taxonomy, where learned men split hairs. Grandmothers stir lentils and hum. Their songs decide in advance what scholars will argue after supper. At a village spring, two women talk in the shade while jars fill in their own time. One is braided into a cord, a small pendant stamped with an old sign for El, and wears it without thinking. The other, newly married, has learned to say the Highland name before she travels, because her mother-in-law does. And this, too, is devotion. Between them, doctrine is a human thing carried in gesture, folded into bread, whispered over infants' and grave. When they speak of the one who sees and hears, the pronouns no longer share their verb with plural nouns. The company in heaven may remain in their imaginations, messengers, wind, watchers, and the neighbors may keep their little gods out of habit. But the center of gravity has moved. There is a one beneath the many, and speaking to him feels less like choosing a patron and more like telling the truth about the way the world, at its best, holds together. In a small sanctuary on a ridge, a priest who has more dust than ceremony about him learns to shift phrasing in the prayers. Where once he might have said, El, hear us, bless the offering, he finds his mouth saying, with the name Most High. Remember, he is not rebelling against tradition. He is following language where it leads, the way water follows the slope it has worn for itself. On festival days, when the elders recite older poems, the younger men smile at lines that call the Storm Lord by a coastal title. Afterward, when they sing their own compositions, the same images bloom but point inward, toward ethics, and upward, toward unity. The cloud is still a chariot. It now belongs, decisively, to the one whose anger is slow, but whose mercy outlasts seasons. Of course, not everyone changes at once. On a hill 2 valleys over, a family keeps a carved pole beside the house and calls it by a mothering name when the goats go missing. In another town, a shrine to a local helper still sees offerings because the road to the central sanctuary is long and people have work to do. Piety walks at the speed of household, not edicts. There are inscriptions later readers will argue about their grammar that seem to bind the Highland name to a possessive that could mean his Asherah or his grove, a phrase from the older domestic piety which refuses to disappear politely. Reformers will travel with hammers. Grandmothers will hide charms in flour sacks. Between them, history will proceed like a caravan negotiating a narrow path in order, but with bumps. In the midst of these hesitations, the fusion of titles continues quietly, helped by the way life proves some prayers and forgets others. A judge quotes a sentence beginning, "You shall not." And 2 men who had intended to settle a field boundary with fists unknot their hands and measure with a cord instead. A drought threatens, and a procession carries a borrowed coastal title up a hill. But the prayer that follows is not for victory over a mythic sea. It is for the strength to cancel debts and open granaries so that the community will be fit to receive rain when it comes. A woman whose husband died in an accident speaks a line she learned as a girl, thanking El for life, and, without pause, addresses the name from the mountain in the same breath, asking for justice in a case that will be heard next market day. The two halves of her sentence do not quarrel. Scribes, attentive to pattern, begin to write the older titles beside the newer name, as if they had always belonged. El Most High becomes a porch on which the mountain name stands and greets. El Almighty becomes a hallway leading to a room where commands are inscribed as promises more than threats. There are songs in which both names appear in consecutive lines, the second line tightening the first like a good knot. There are blessings in which the one is called by a father's tenderness and a storm's authority and a judge's patience, without any sense that the worshiper has moved between deities. Language circles until it finds a center and then sits down there. Relearning, if you listen carefully at dusk, when town and field exchange their news and the evening meal is more gratitude than cuisine, you can hear how the fusion changes. Expectation. People ask less for spectacle and more for steadiness. They still want rain, who does not? But they have learned to ask also for fair weights. True testimony. Courage to forgive a debt on the seventh year. They still fear thunder, but they have learned to fear injustice more, because thunder passes and injustice makes a season rot from inside. The one who hears these prayers is not conceived as a specialist among specialists. He is the court of last resort and first principle. Old titles have not been discarded. They have been put to work. A final image before sleep takes your edge. A courtyard lit by small lamp. A family gathered after the day's heat has bled away. The grandfather, who remembers a time when prayers felt like a list of offices to visit, now closes his eyes and blesses his grandchildren with a single name and many titles: Most High, Almighty, Merciful and Gracious, Slow to Anger, Abounding in Steadfast Love and Faithfulness. He does not think of debates. He thinks of rain when it was needed and of a neighbor forgiven when it was not deserved. He has lived long enough to know that the true test of any God is not poetry, but the kind of people who emerge from the worship. Around him, the lamps breathe. Above him, a few early stars argue politely with the dark. He sleeps with the sense, not a conclusion, more like a settled weather, that the old words have found their home. Markets return a kind of music to the hills. Goats protesting their counts, copper glinting in baskets, figs pretending to be more than sugar and memory. On such days, piety walks among stalls as matter-of-factly as corn. It is not the thunderous pageantry of capitals. It is bracelets with small signs against fever, jars with scratches that mean blessing, cords knotted twice rather than once, because someone's grandmother swore that's how you keep misfortune from slipping the loop. In doorways, you can see shelves that have collected a household's hope, a lamp, a grinding stone that has turned more years than anyone will admit, a little figure worked in clay to stand for care in childbirth, and tucked against the back, a sliver of wood or a potsherd with letters that keep a threshold honest. Here, devotion is domestic. It smells like bread and oil and the occasional indulgence of incense when coins permit. If you ask the families who keep these arrangements whether they believe in one God or many, the answers would be neither simple nor evasive. A grandmother might say, there is one above all, the one whose name we do not waste. And then, without second thought, straighten the amulet tied above the cradle that bears a title from older days. A farmer might thank the name from the mountain for rain and, on the same afternoon, mutter a request to the small clay helper that watches the goat's enclosure. The logic is not a system, it is a survival kit. In times when danger arrives in many disguises, drought, sickness. Officials from elsewhere with new rules, prayer scatters like seed. Some sprouts will take. If you walk a little farther out from the market, past courtyards where lentils cool and mint bruises under the pestle, you will find hilltop places that have been called sacred longer than the oldest man's beard. An altar stone blackens and grays in layers, the way a mountain remembers winter. There is no grand building, only a view and a habit. Offerings come as families can manage. A bird, a measure of grain, a skin of wine whose sacrifice is felt more keenly than declared. The prayers mix old titles and the name, as water mixed from two springs becomes one drink. On days when a storm hesitates on the horizon, people listen to it the way one listens at a door before knocking. If it breaks kindly, a sigh runs through the village like a blessing passed hand to hand. The tug of war between hearth devotion and the claim of a single name does not play out in a treatise. It plays out in kitchens. A mother pins a pendant inside her daughter's dress and tells her, "Say the name when you are afraid." Then adds, softly, an older invocation for safe paths at dusk. A father who has learned a law about fair measures from a teacher in the town square replaces the family's worn weights. Though the old ones have favored him for years, he does not say he is worshiping. He says he is tired of the way cheating makes him feel. In his chest, the thunder that once was only weather has become a thud of conscience. From time to time, letters appear on plastered walls or on shards that had previous lives as pictures. They are short name fragments, wishes, and their grammar becomes a sport for scholars long after the hands that wrote them are asleep. A line here binds blessing to the name with a tenderness that feels like a hand on a shoulder. Another line somewhere else, damaged by weather and opinion, seems to couple the name with a possessive that points toward an old domestic helper, a grove, a pole, a mother title that once stood beside doorways and saw too much. The village reads none of this as a scandal. It reads it as Tuesday. Reform is a visitor. Habit is a host. There are households where the old arrangements are pared away. A young couple, moved by a teacher who spoke of a covenant as if it could be tasted, removes the figurines from the shelf and keeps only a lamp and a small stone taken from a place where they made vows. For them, the name suffices. Their neighbors watch with the curiosity that people reserve for austerity and saints. Across the lane, another family keeps a carved pole at the corner of the courtyard and names it with a word. The grandmother refuses to surrender. "Because it helped us when your uncle was born blue," she says. And no one argues with that memory. Between these houses, a friendship persists, stitched by shared bread and the simple shame of being caught borrowing salt. In a village court shaded by an old terebinth, the name's gravity is tested. Two men have brought a quarrel about an irrigation channel that curled where it should have run straight. Each presents witnesses, and each witness remembers the past from the angle that best fits the present. The elder who sits to hear them does not thunder. He repeats lines that begin with "you shall," until the heat in the men's cheeks lowers a degree. He orders the channel corrected and the harvest from the disputed strip shared for a season. The losing man, a little more losing than the other, touches the edge of his cloak and says the name under his breath, because saying it out loud would make it seem like he were bargaining with his own anger. He goes home and eats in silence, but when he sleeps, he rests. The next morning, he and his neighbor work with their sons to straighten stones along the water's run. The worship here is indistinguishable from repair. Farther up the ridge, in a sanctuary where an older priest keeps careful watch over careful routine, the prayers have begun to change without permission. Where once the invocations named a roster of patrons like a season's sponsors, they now reach quickly, almost impatiently, for the name that has learned to gather titles, like a cloak collects light. Most High, the priest says, and then the name. Almighty, he says, and then the name. The one who rides on the clouds, he says, and then the name. He does not remark upon it. Words have learned their own order, and he has learned to follow. When a family brings a thank offering for a child who lived, he blesses them with the blessing his grandfather used. And then he adds a sentence about walking justly and loving mercy that his grandfather did not know. The old men nod. They do not love change, but they love grandchildren. Not every hill approves. In towns where the older domestic piety holds firm, visitors from the central sanctuary are received politely and then ignored. As one ignores a salesman who believes too deeply in his product, hammers arrive with slogans. Charms retreat to deeper drawers. When a drought lasts, each party blames the other's laxity. The village's patience with argument is long, but not infinite. Everyone has onions to weed and cords to mend. Time sorts the fervors, the way a sieve sorts flour from chaff. What stays is what makes life possible among neighbors who will carry each other's funerals up the same path. Even as household shelves remain mixed, something in speech clarified. Children learn that the messengers and the winds are not gods who can be flattered into small favors, but couriers who deliver what they are given. The council in heaven, still a picture on serious days, loses its democracy. The one speaks, the rest obey. When boys argue about whose household helper is stronger, the girls laugh and tell them to grow up. Justice is the strongest, one said, in the tone of a kitchen proverb, and the boys learn that this is not an invitation to debate. At the year's turn, a procession climbs a local height. The older hymns are sung, and their thunder feels good in the chest. Tradition is a kind of muscle memory. Then a younger voice reads a short instruction about releasing debts and letting fields lie obedient for a season, so the land can breathe, and so the poor can breathe. 2. The two moments do not cancel each other. The storm image stirs courage. The instruction trains it. People go home with the pleasant ache that follows a climb and the quiet ache that follows being asked to be decent in ways that cost them. Their shelves remain their shelf. Their prayers are a little less divided than their shelf. And always, there are the small scenes that doctrine forgets to count. A woman whose husband died in a fall visits a neighbor and is sent home with bread, still talking to itself as it cools. She sets the loaf down and touches the shelf where the lamp and the plaque and the little figure stand. She says the name and then, as if reminding herself that a house is not a syllable, she says thank you to the neighbor out loud, with her whole mouth. A boy, catching his hand in the door and biting back a curse he has heard in the market, instead spits out the first word of a line that begins, "You shall not," and finds that the pain travels through the syllables and leaves him a shade more dignified. A judge, alone after dusk, weighs a difficult case and cannot bear his own cleverness. He lights the lamp on his shelf and sits in its cone until his thoughts stop arranging themselves in his favor. He falls asleep with soot on his thumb and wakes with the kind of decision that makes enemies slowly and friends eventually. If sleep has come close and is listening, tell it this: the season we are crossing is not a clean victory march from many to one. It is a patient reorganization of cupboards and sentences. The name does not succeed by shattering every figurine in a righteous frenzy. It succeeds by proving, in courts and kitchens, that a single, steady will for justice drains chaos as surely as storm drains sea. In the next part, the winds will stiffen, rival altars will be named in public, and a hill will host a test that measures not only lightning but answer. Even then, the measure that matters will be the old one. Which voice leaves a people more honest with one another when the clouds have gone? Drought hardens tempers before it hardens ground. In the northern hills, cisterns begin to sound hollow when you speak over them, and the air carries dust the way a tired person carries a secret cloth. Unavoidable. Fields learn to pretend. They green at dawn and confess by noon. Livestock stand at the edges of their own shadows and look like drawing. In such a season, the storm lord of the coast seems a practical friend to court, if rain can be negotiated. Then, the negotiator who knows the sea's moods is the one to invite. Altars multiply not from excess piety, but from fear. If one God does not answer, surely another will. A name that asks for exclusivity sounds expensive. So a hill is chosen that watches both coast and inland, a stage where sea wind and desert breath can argue. The crowd climbs with the dead. The smell is stone warming, sweat sweetening, cedar smoke remembering its tree, and beneath it all, the salt of expectation. 2 arrangements are made. 2 altars, 2 bulls, 2 sets of hands, 2 choruses ready to shout. The rules are simple and have the decency of fairness. No hidden fire, no trick flint, no embers smuggled under ash. Let the God who answers with fire be recognized. It is a public problem set, and the solution must be visible. The priests of rain song start first. They know their routine. They have invoked weather on terraces and harbor heights. Their rhythm build steps in dust, kicking up a fog like premature incense. They call titles that have worked before Cloud Rider, Seabinder, Spearbright, Stormbringer, and the crowd answers because crowds know their line. Hours pass. A rope pulled and pulled that will not move the stone. The sun, indifferent, marks the stage with light that climbs from ankle to throat. A murmur begins at the edges, the market instinct that counts costs. The dancers' legs grow heavy, the chant fray. Their God may yet answer at sunset, someone said. Perhaps, but the test was not written for dusk. Then, in a tone tuned to irritation and sorrow, another voice interrupts the theater to make space for something plainer. Stones are counted 12, a number that knows its people, and set together until the shape remembers an older altar. broken by neglect or zeal. No one quite agrees. The wood is set in a way that will waste nothing. Water is asked for, and here the act becomes scandal. To pour water in a drought is to use hope as a prop. Still, jars are filled at a spring that is not given up and emptied over the offering until trench and wood and sacrifice and ground remember the kindness of rain. The crowd shifts, pulled by the drama of loss into attention. The prayer is short, a sentence that asks for recognition rather than spectacle, for hearts to turn rather than a crowd to gasp. It calls the name and names the Father, but it does not wheel through titles like a merchant through samples. It is as brief as trust. Then fire comes, not lightning hurled from some partisan cloud, but a collapse of waiting into decision. Flames take the wet wood with alarming ease, as if obedience were their fuel. The trench steams. The air drinks the last syllables of the prayer, and the crowd's breath with the same calm appetite. For a moment, there is no noise at all. The silence is not shock. It is alignment. What follows, in some telling, breaks the bedtime tone. Zeal, purred, the harsh arithmetic of reform that tries to end a drought by ending ambiguity. Tonight we acknowledge that such moments exist and step back from their edge. What matters for our path is not the sword, but the sentence that came before it, the one that asked for hearts to turn. The turning begins in the quiet before the shout returns. The crowd, seeing an answer that needs no amplification, finds the line it must speak and speaks it. That the name is not merely a specialist among specialists, not a last-minute weather consultant, but the one to whom weather belongs. The hill hears the line and holds it. Clouds appear, late to the drama, shaped by pressures that do not care for altars or dance. A small one rises from the sea like a promise sent in a child's size to test the town's patience. Wind arrives as a rumor in juniper and broom. The prophet, whose bones know the language of weather, but whose heart now listens for quieter news, runs before the rain, as if escorting it inland. The king's chariot, heavy with embarrassment and relief, takes the easier path. The first drops slap the dust and make the sound of debts being reduced. In an hour, the land smells like it remembers how to forgive. If you stand aside and ask what was proven, you receive two answers, both true. One is that the God who answered with fire can command elements without committee. The other is that the answer was never meant to be theater. It was meant to be persuasion. The purpose of the flame was not to humiliate a rival liturgy, but to retire a certain habit of hedging to loosen the grip of households on their portfolios of piety. You cannot keep a charm above the door that promises favoritism, and also ask for a law that binds you and your neighbor alike. The hill did not abolish rain priests. It made bargaining feel small. The drought ends, but the argument about devotion does not. Some go home and put away figurines. Some tuck them deeper into cupboards, with a mutter about grandchildren not understanding how the world really works. A few hammer at shrine. A few hide amulets in the hems of cloak. Most, as ever, rise at dawn and decide one choice at a time. Yet the weather has changed in more ways than one. The phrase, "Who answers?" now hears differently in the ear. Answer does not mean mere performance. It means a call and response between conscience and command. The storm god who wins by thunder becomes, in the following day, the god whose victory appears in fair measures and released debts, and a widow's jar that is not empty when it should be. The story does not end on the hill, because no story ends on a stage. It moves into kitchens and courts, into the slow work of centralizing worship, not as control, but as coherence. Altars that kept a town divided by loyalties begin to look like redundant signposts on a road that has finally been made straight. Not all will agree, and some will resist in ways that have their own poems. Reform is never only a sentence, it is a season. But a sentence was spoken, and a hill heard it, and the sound of that sentence echoes in the next reforms that come from kings who are tired of divided hearts and divided tithe. Watch one small after scene. A boy who attended the hill because his father would not risk the gossip of staying home sits on a wall with his feet not touching the ground. He holds a damp piece of wood he took from the trench after the crowd thinned. It smells like both storm and heart. He cannot articulate why, but the smell comforts him more than the shouting did. When he is a man and his own roof leak, he will fix it and pay his workers before nightfall and not know he is quoting a fire. Another after scene. A woman whose shelf has held both a lamp and a charm since her mother's day removes the charm and wraps it in cloth and puts it under a stone behind the house. She does not call this destruction. She calls it tidying. In the space she cleared, she sets a small smooth stone from a valley they visited years ago, where they made a promise that felt like a room appearing in the open air. She says the name and then washes lentils. The stew tastes like rain. A final afterscene in the royal court, because palaces feel weather too. The king, having both felt the sting of drought and the sting of being corrected in public. Here's a line from an old law, read aloud by a scribe too young to tremble. The line is about justice that refuses bribe and truth that refuses flattery. The king stares at the window where rain threads the view into moving cloth. He does not become a saint in a paragraph, but a small decision is made about a case that will never be written down. And a man outside goes home with his field intact and his children less afraid of winter. When sleep leans near, let the hill be quiet in your mind. Do not replay the dance or the heat. Keep the short prayer and the answering flame and the cloud that began like a child's hand. Keep the idea that power, when it is true, does not need many words, and that the best tests measure not lightning, but what hearts do when the theater is finished. In the next part, as altars come down and a single sanctuary is asked to hold the weight of a people's hope, we will listen for the difference between order that liberates and order that merely rearranges furniture. We will watch how a name that learned to walk with tents teaches cities to keep faith without losing breath. Cities breathe differently from tents. Their chests rise and fall in courtyards, not in canvas. When reform comes to a city, it arrives with lists and ladders. Men in charge of storerooms count what belongs to whom. Men in charge of steps count which ones lead to which doors. A king whose sleep has been shortened by drought and divided worship looks over the roofs of his capital and decides that devotion should have an address the way law has a seal. Hezekiah is the name that gathers this impulse in one generation, Josiah in another. Between them runs a thread of intent. If the name is one, let the altar be one, not because one is easier to guard, though it is, but because scattered loyalties make scattered hearts. A people who can pray anywhere must learn when not to pray everywhere. The decree is simple on parchment and complicated in villages. High places, those hilltop shrines that have kept families brave through lean years, are to come down. Local altars, where a vow could be remembered in the very wind that first carried it, are to be quiet. The road that led to worship will now often be longer, and the hands that carry offerings will tire before they reach the gate. Reformers bring hammers and scriptures and a conviction that coherence is mercy, even when it feels like loss. They do not arrive with malice. They arrive with measurements. Here, they say, tapping a stone with the iron sense of righteousness. This will be taken apart so that something truer can stand longer than all of us. In one town, the edict meets a shelf that has hosted a household's hope for 3 generations. The grandmother wipes the little figurine with the same tenderness she gives to copper pots. Her daughter unties the amulet over the door with hands that have learned to tremble less. The grandson, who went to the capital last spring and heard a teacher speak of covenant like bread, argues gently for the new way. If the name fills heaven, he says, he hears without a hint. The grandmother sigh, not because she disagrees, but because habits have their own piety. She wraps the figure in cloth and sets it in a basket for the priest to take, though she tucks into her apron a small smooth stone from the old altar. For touching, she says, reform is a public act, memory is domestic. In another place, a high place overlooks terraces that depend on a canal older than legend. The altar there has been a court, a clinic, a town hall. It is hard to convince farmers that the city's temple can hear a quarrel about a boundary stone with the same intimacy. A young official, loyal and stiff, reads the decree while his escort watches the villagers' faces. An elder asks to speak and does so without bitterness. We will obey, he said. But remember that the name judged us here for years, and we learn justice by walking up this path. The official nods because he recognizes the truth of what he has not lived. He leaves with a pole half sawn and a prayer he does not write down, that the new order will pay back the trust it is borrowing. Inside the city, another work proceeds with less spectacle, but more consequence. Scribes gather older songs and laws and stories and copy them with a care that feels like worship. They do not invent the name. They arrange a room for him to be heard. And because memory is like water seeking shape, the act of arranging changes the listening. Passages that once let a reader imagine many divine offices begin to be read under a single light. Titles settle onto the name, the way birds settle onto a branch they have always wanted. Editorial hands do not always agree. How could they? But the direction is evident. The cloud's chariot, the council's hush, the sea's obedience, the Most High's patience. These images are gathered like harvest into granaries where a people can be fed for lean seasons. Reform is not only subtraction, it is also addition of weight to words that had begun to float. A priest at the central sanctuary learns a new cadence in the sacrifices, a way of speaking that remembers the wilderness even while standing beneath cedar beams. He lifts his hands and blesses with the old blessing, and then adds a line about the poor having a right to the corners of a field that no priest owns. He begins to see the temple not only as a destination, but as a school, teaching a nation to prefer justice to spectacle. Pilgrims arrive with their animals and their anxieties. They leave with songs that ask more of them than of heaven. In palace rooms where power forgets that it is a trust, reform looks like resistance. A king who has inherited counselors fond of convenience hears a line from a rediscovered law and feels the floor move under him like a boat. Josiah is reported to have torn his robe upon hearing it, an ancient way of admitting that your clothes have been dressing a stranger. He sends for advice and is told that repentance is not a mood, but a program. Remove what trains people toward divided hearts. Teach what holds them in one piece. He sets men to the task, and they go about it with the zeal of those who have finally been given a job that fits their bones. Papers are burned, poles come down, doors are shut that should never have been opened. Doors are opened that should never have been shut. Not all zeal is wise. There are places where the hammer swings too hard and breaks more than it should, where a grandmother's grief is treated as idolatry rather than as love, wearing an old coat. There are speeches that confuse uniformity with unity and mistake volume for clarity. But in the ordinary run of days, something steadier than zeal takes root. Children learn that pilgrimage is a practice, not a punishment. Traders discover that centralized festivals are good for business and, surprisingly, for conscience. Judges begin to cite the same lines in different towns, and a sense grows slow as moss that the law is bigger than any one voice. The name, spoken in a single sanctuary, does not feel contained. It feels magnified. Then history arrives with its unsentimental arithmetic. An empire to the north, practiced at pruning nations to fit its ledger, collapses a neighbor and then reaches for the next brand. In Israel, the northern kingdom, shrines are emptied by force rather than reform. Populations are shifted the way a landlord rearranges furniture, and the breath of a people thins. Refugees cross into Judah, carrying more than pots. They carry song, proverbs, family law, grief. In the capital, the central sanctuary receives not only offerings, but arrivals. The name, who once walked with 10, now shelters those who have none. The unity reform sought is given a harsher face-shared loss. Scribes respond the way scribes do when the world shakes. They copy in the quiet after panic. They stitch narratives with threads of law and lament. The old council scenes shrink to the size of a courtroom where a single judge calls nations to account. The storm titles survive, but they flare now inside poems where thunder's purpose is to announce truth about justice rather than to win a duel for reign. A theology that might have remained a city project deepens into a lifeline. If the name can be met in one sanctuary, perhaps he can be met in all places, because his address is not stone, but promise. Reform becomes resilient. You can see the shift in small scene. A woman from the north, whose village burned, stands in the outer court with a basket that is more apology than tithe. A priest takes it and says a blessing that includes a line about a wandering ancestor who found a home by being asked into a covenant. The woman hears herself in that line and weeps without embarrassment. A boy who arrived with her watches the smoke rise and cannot shake the feeling that the pillar he has seen in stories is not entirely past tense. He will grow into a man who believes that the name can walk roads that empires pave and can keep a people coherent when their map is torn. There are also households where the loss hardens into hoarding. The gods of our fathers fail. Someone mutters in a courtyard grime streaked with rebuilding. A cousin, who has begun to love the reforms, answers without scorn, "Our fathers failed the God who told us how to live together." The argument is not won that day. Arguments rarely are, but the law is there to be read aloud the next market morn, and reading has its way of making rhetoric small. Night in the city changes during reform. The streets quiet a little earlier, as if the day's talk requires more time to settle. In houses where amulets once clicked against doorposts, palms touch wood with the same instinct but different words. A father recites to his children lines that begin with his, teaching ears to be loyal before hands learn expensive devotions. A mother, tired to the bone, folds dough and folds into her daughter a sentence about loving the one with heart, soul, and might that feels less like piety than like sanity. The temple lamps burn, but the light that matters most is the one that stays in a household long after sacrifices are done. If sleep is near, let it take this with it. Centralization in these hands was not meant to cage the divine, but to free a people from the fatigue of pleasing many small patrons. A single sanctuary was chosen not because God needed a house, but because humans needed a home base. A place to reset their loyalty to justice and mercy. Hammers took down altars, pens raised up coherence. Some grief was clumsy, some zeal was kind. In the next part, the room we have arranged will be shaken by a heavier hand. Exile will test whether a name can travel without losing holiness, and prophets will teach us to hear thunder as a sentence that begins not with "be impressed," but with "do right." Exile does not begin with crossing a border. It begins the moment a rumor becomes a fact in your chest. Armies move like weather systems, cold fronts of iron, high pressures of intent, and the city reads the sky too late. Gates that have welcomed caravans learn the sound of battery. Walls that felt like memory's backbone reveal themselves to be stone. In rooms that once held the hum of ordinary holiness, priests pack what can be carried and argue in whispers about what can be left without betrayal. Some swear the name will make a last-minute path where there is no path. Others, quieter, tie up scrolls with the deliberateness of men who know that holiness has endured loss before. The day the gates fail, the noise is everywhere and nowhere a single, continuous shout of wood, fire, command. Families throw on cloaks as if cloth could choose their fate. A child grabs the wrong small hand and is returned by a stranger with a tenderness that makes the mother ache. In courtyard, altars die without drama, their stones dismantled by men who understand neither the words once spoken there, nor the gentleness of those who spoke them. The temple is not merely entered. It is understood as a storehouse by those who count value in metals. Gold behaves, as it always does, with perfect neutrality, agreeing to be weighed by whoever holds the scale when the fires settle to their slow red. The city is a map of grief and ash. The name, some say with bitterness, has been defeated. Others, remembering a longer story, whisper that the name has chosen to argue with them in a harsher grammar. Exile is a road before it is a land. The columns move soldiers, prisoners, the resigned. The furious and dust writes a temporary cloud over the route that disappears by evening, as if refusing to keep the record. Along the way, there are small compass points of mercy. A stranger passes water to a woman who has run out. A guard looks the other way, so a father can walk beside his son for a while. An old man is given a place in a wagon, contrary to policy, because someone remembers a grandfather who once needed help getting down a hill. People discover that prayer is a verb that does not require a building. They learn the taste of psalms sung softly enough to keep teeth unclenched. They learn that the name can be said under a foreign sky without sounding foreign by the great river. Life refuses to be only sorrow. Houses are made from understanding and mud. Markets return because markets always do. Grief becomes periodic rather than permanent. Like a tide, a heart can learn. Those who cannot imagine singing in a strange land do not sing. Those who must sing to live find that the old hymns survive translation. New songs are written too. They do not praise conquest or cleverness. They reach beyond outcomes to character. The name is gracious, a line says, and a woman repeating it feels the sentence finding a place to sit between her ribs. The grammar of worship lengthens until it includes both lament and trust without contradiction. Prophets rise like necessary weather. 1. Far from the temple's lost court, sees a vision that corrects despair at scale. He speaks of wheels within wheel, eyes in motion, and a throne that refuses to be nailed to any one hill. The glory that once filled the house in the city proves to be a traveler, unwilling to leave the people alone, even in their deserved trouble. The images are difficult on purpose. They break the habit of imagining the divine as an object to be guarded. The mobile throne insists, holiness is not a local asset. It is a presence that can convict, comfort, and command in a camp by a river as surely as under cedar beams. Another voice addresses those left in the ruined city, who walk among the familiar streets as if inside a dream, with cruel continuity. Do not trust in the temple as if it were a charm, he had said earlier, when walls still stood and self-deception had money for incense. Do justice, he had said, and then come sing. Now, when there is no temple to misuse, his words sound less like accusation and more like rescue. Holiness was never finally housed in stone. It was practiced in how you handled a stranger at your gate. The critique of spectacle becomes a mercy to those without a stain. A third voice, stitched into what later readers will call comfort, sings like a night watchman who has seen the first graying at the horizon. He says the name is the maker of the ends of the earth, and that tiredness is not an indictment, but a condition for which strength can be given. He raises an audacious claim that besides the name, there is no other, not merely as a local preference, but as a global truth. And he links that claim not to thunder, but to tenderness, a shepherd carrying lambs close, a servant who refuses to break bruised things. Here the storm titles are not discarded. They are rescored for an instrument tuned to mercy. Power is not less. It is more discipline, more intimate. In Babylon's streets, under carved gates that declare dominion in baked glaze, exiles learn the odd dignity of keeping covenant without land. Sabbath becomes a teacher with a portable classroom. Circumcision becomes a signature kept in flesh when signatures in stone are forbidden. Meals turn into liturgy. Doorposts become scroll hosts. A table set in a rented room becomes a quiet declaration that the world is still structured by gratitude. Children learn to ask, in the cadence of a small prayer, what is permitted and what is good. The answers, surprisingly, survive distance. The God who once parted waters proves equally adept at parting days, keeping rest sacred in the midst of empires that mistake exhaustion for efficiency. Not all who speak for the name comfort. Some argue sharply with those who forecast a quick end to humiliation. Do not listen to the prophets who sell you an easy dawn. One writes in a letter sent like a seed packet. Build houses, plant gardens, seek the peace of the city where you live, for your peace will be braided into an exile. In this telling is not a pause between identical chapters. It is a curriculum. Faithfulness is measured not by outrage alone, but by the patient arrangement of ordinary goodness in enemy land. Fare waits at a foreign market. Kindness to a neighbor whose ancestors burned your letters. Prayers for rulers whose decrees have emptied your shelves. Meanwhile, scribes do what scribes do when time lengthens. They edit hope, not cynically, but carefully. They gather laws and history, laments and song, and they weave them so that a reader stepping into the story after disaster will not trip. The old images survive, but their center glows differently. Divine council scenes, once useful for mapping heaven to palaces, become hints of an order that looks less like competition and more like choreography under a single will. Sea combat imagery, once a favorite of coastal festival, is recast as a moral victory over violence and lie. The word holy expands from cultic precision to ethical clarity, and the name that carried tents now carries a people's future through the editorial kindness of those who refuse to let disaster be the last paragraph. There are small rooms where this work is felt more than understood. A father teaches his son to read by tracing a line that begins with "here" and presses on to "love." The boy's lips move. His finger leaves a faint trail of oil on the ink where he rests it. A widow sells woven belts in a market and counts her coins with a slow honesty that makes buyers trust her. At home, She lights a lamp and thanks the maker for breath, like a ritual learned from a mother who learned it from a mother in a city that no longer stands. A girl presses green shoots into a pot of dirt and waters them with a cup too small to waste. When the sprigs take, she decides the world is not finished with mercy. Empires tire of their own victory. One king who believed himself the axis becomes a paragraph. Another, whose policy is subtle, opens the way for some to return. The road home is different from the road out. Hope walks next to caution like two relatives who keep each other honest. The first sight of the old hills undoes some, not with joy, but with the ache of recognizing what time does to places we thought would wait. The city is a body with scars. The Temple Mount is a memory asking for hands. Work begins with rubble, always with rubble. And songs are written that know both gratitude and grit. Those who sow in tears will reap with shouts. A line promises, and men who have learned to mistrust hyperbole find themselves humming it as they lift stones. Rebuilding teaches its own theology. The altar rises before walls do, as if to declare that the point of walls was always worship and justice, never the other way around. Foundations are laid with ceremony and doubt, standing shoulder to shoulder. Some elders weep when they see the footprint, because it does not match the old grandeur. Some youths shout because any footprint at all feels like a future. The sound mixes into something the text calls noise, and God, who never mistook volume for truth, hears both as honest. The reforms return, but they are less about hammers now and more about hearts. Foreign wives are sent away, in a scene that has made generations wince, a decision born of fear that identity will dissolve again into the empire's flood. Other decisions go the other way. Doors are opened wide to the poor. Debts are released with a seriousness that makes landowners look away. Sabbaths are guarded with a gladness that gives servants back their names. The name that traveled proves still to be a teacher more than a talisman. Priests and governors learn, slowly, that holiness measured only by separation becomes small. Holiness braided with mercy becomes strong. Through it all, the prophet's music lingers. A servant song about suffering chosen, rather than inflicted, becomes a lantern for those who prefer repair to spectacle. A promise about a new covenant, one written not on stone, but within, gives language to people who have seen what external vows can and cannot do. A vision of nation, a nation streaming to a mountain to learn war's end, gives the city permission to hope for more than narrow survival. These are not decorations, they are architecture. They hold up the roof when storms return. If your eyes are heavy, let the lesson settle without forcing its edges. The God who once thundered from a mountain and answered with fire on a hill, walked out of a burned city with his people, sat by a foreign river with them, argued them into honesty, comforted them beyond their desert, and brought them home with enough humility to rebuild slower, truer. He did not become smaller by leaving his house. He became, for them, larger Lord not only of weather and walls, but of time, memory, and the moral muscle that keeps community from collapsing when empires press. In the next part, we will listen as titles thin into clarity, councils remembered as choreography, angels keeping errands instead of throne, and a people learning to say one without apology, not as a boast against neighbors, but as a vow to be the kind of community one God deserves. By the time the city's stones remember laughter again, speech has changed. Words that once needed many chairs now require only one, the old image of a council worthy once, because it helped minds imagine order, remains like a fresco whose outlines you can still see under new paint. Messenger beings do not vanish. They keep their errands and lose their thrones. The room grows quieter when decrees are made. One voice names good and evil. The rest become wind and fire, moving where they are sent. The imagination, relieved, stops weighing the heavens like a market and begins to trust that justice is not a coalition, but a character. Listen to how prayers thin into strength. An elder who used to stack titles like shields now speaks plainly. You, who see. Another adds a verb and finds it is enough. Remember, a widow, mending a garment whose elbows have failed from honesty, whispers only the name and lets needle and thread finish the sentence. Liturgies keep their poetry. The human throat is built for more than prose, but the poetry now serves clarity. Holy no longer means only fit for the altar. it means fit for the neighbor. Glory means not only brightness, but the weight of goodness you cannot pretend not to feel. The sea, that old vocabulary for chaos, is still there at the edge of thought. But the duel has been rewritten. No annual reenactments are needed to keep the waters obedient. Instead, a judge's refusal to take a bribe is celebrated with a quiet fervor that once belonged to storm drama. Farmers still watch the sky like students. They also watch their scales like priests. The victory over chaos becomes a weekday practice. Debts released on the schedule. Gleanings left with intention. Testimony kept true when fear would make it economical to forget. When a psalm says the voice of the name is over the waters, it is not only re-singing thunder, it is reporting that conscience can be heard even when commerce is loud. Angels, who once might have been imagined as minor lords with local portfolio, learn modesty without losing speed. They pass through stories like light under a door announcing, guarding, striking, saving, but they do not collect worship. Children draw them as wings because obedience looks like that in a mind that hasn't yet learned cynicism. Scribes name them with restraint, as if too much fascination would tangle the lines and let hierarchy creep back in. The point is not that there is less in heaven. The point is that the one is not crowded. There is a grammar lesson that begins to visit kitchens. It comes to fathers teaching sons to bless bread, to mothers teaching daughters to bless sleep. It begins with a line that starts here and continues with the stubborn simplicity of a vow. The name is one, not one among not one nearby, not one at the top of a list when the way a heart is one. The line does something to ears. People start to hear commandments as privacy lowered rather than raised in intimacy offered by law. To love with heart, soul. Might is not to perform an emotion. It is to let desire and schedule and strength be braided by one will strong enough to hold ordinary days in place. In the courts, language keeps doing moral work. Judges speak as if the poor were not an inconvenience, but a measuring device. Priests teach that ritual without fairness is a kind of theft, and that fairness without reverence loses breath. Poets keep storm music in their quivers, but aim it differently. He rides the clouds becomes a way to say, no tyranny will stand forever. Your secret cruelty is not secret. He treads the sea become. He crosses what we cannot to reach those who think no one is coming. When the choir sings that idols have mouths and do not speak, eyes and do not see, it is not only a taunt at stone, it is a warning to hearts that prefer gods who will never argue back. A small story, a merchant, known for prices that sometimes lean on the trusting, lies awake because a line from a hymn has attached itself to his pillow. Who may ascend the hill? The song had asked, and the answer had included clean hands and a tongue that does not cut truth into saleable pieces. He rises before light and reweights his measure, shaving off the advantage he once called cleverness. He loses a little coin that morning and a little shame he did not know was costing him more. When he says the name at noon, it feels less like paperwork and more like air. Another story. A girl, newly able to read, finds a line about the heavens telling glory. She goes outside at night with a clay lamp and holds it low so the stars can have their say without competition. She decides that if the world is being honest in public, she can be honest in private, and returns a bracelet she found at the well that afternoon. No thunder praises her. Her mother does, and that is how the lesson is designed to arrive. In the sanctuaries rebuilt from grief, the service settles into a shape that feels like breathing. Exhale confession, inhale mercy, exhale petition, inhale trust. The singers keep their old metaphors. The priests wash their hands with older care. The words that used to be debated now sit with the calm of furniture. On festival day, pilgrims bring a year's worth of ordinary faithfulness in baskets grain measured fair. Disputes settled before sunset. Servants rested as selves, not tools, and lay it down as if it were spice. The smoke rises, and the old mountain stories are recited without embarrassment. No one needs to pretend the sky is different tonight. They only need to remember that the one who made it is not restrained by it. A scholar in a small room writes marginal notes with the gentleness of a man moving a sleeping child. He shapes an older reading of a divine assembly, so that it becomes a rhetorical stage on which the uniqueness of the one can be heard more clearly. He does not demolish the picture. He edits its audience down to angels and winds and lightning that applauds on cue. In another book, He glosses the old sea battle with a proverb about violence that devours itself. He is careful not to boast. He has seen what boasting does to nations. Meanwhile, across alleys and seasons, ordinary people prove metaphysics by accident. A debt is forgiven without the pleasure of humiliating the debtor. A widow's field is defended by neighbors who learned a line of law by singing it. A slave is released into a market that greets him by name and not by price. None of these acts make a hymn in the moment. Later, they will. You can tell a theology has settled when good behavior starts to hum at a pitch low enough for sleep to like it. There is still superstition. There is always superstition. The mind's attempt to buy control from fear at a discount. Charms circulate like rumors. Sayings hitch rides on caravans and claim to be wisdom. But the center has stiffened in the right way. A child who watches her father refuse a bribe at the city gate will not be impressed by an amulet. An old woman who has been carried to temple on a day when her knees refuse will bless the one for breath, even if the year has been spiteful. The single will at the center. The one makes the many wills around it less frantic. At times the claim hardens into sentence. Besides me there is no other. A prophet writes, while under the same ink declares the maker gentle with bruised things. The pairing is not contradiction, it is calibration. If there were others, you might shop for better terms. If the one were not gentle, you would never bring him your failing. The bedrock tightness of one keeps ethics from turning faddish. The tenderness keeps monotheism from becoming an efficient coal. A traveler from a coast, hearing all this, asks whether the storm has been exiled. The answer is to invite him to court on a day when a case about a boundary is heard with care that would shame kings. He watches as witnesses are questioned without cruelty, as law is quoted without theater, as a verdict is handed down that no one loves, in all respect. On the way out, a sudden rain slips between clouds and ground, and the market discovers laughter. The traveler shrugged. Chastened, your God still rides the cloud, he says. He just prefers to write with rain in hearts, because we are honest. We keep a quiet corner for mystery. The one who simplified heaven also leaves visions that defy diagram. Wheels spin with eyes. A coal burns a mouth clean. A voice calls from a thinness so fine that mountains do not bother to echo it. None of this undoes clarity. It prevents conceit. If a child asks, what does the one look like? The mother answers with verbs. He creates. He remembers. He lifts. He judges. He binds. He heals. Then she names the neighbor who needs bread tomorrow, and the widow whose fence has fallen, and says, let us look like him. When night lays its cool hand on the city, prayers retreat to rooms and rooftop. The line about one is said as lullaby and as promise kept. Old counsels fade to background, like constellations you can name if you want to, but do not need. Angels keep their errands without collecting fans. The sea sleeps, and the markets do, too, in the silence. A sentence can be heard, the same one from the mountain, the hill. The exile's river short, demanding, merciful, do right, love mercy, walk humbly. The thunder has not ceased. It has learned to speak softly, so the words can be remembered. Close your eyes. Let the room simplify. One lamp, one breath, one name. In the next part, those words will press further inward, turning ritual into conscience so steadily that even the festivals will seem like rehearsals for kindness, and the last loudness left to God will be the kind that heals. Ritual can teach a hand what holiness feels like, but conscience teaches a hand what to do when no one is watching. In the years after return, when altars smoke again and songs find their step, the current runs beneath the liturgy and pulls it toward the heart. Priests lift bowls with proper weight. Choirs learn the intervals that let large crowds breathe together. The calendar sets out feasts like lamps along a road. Yet the truest work happens where no choir can assist. In the busy quiet between market and meal. In the pause before a hasty word. In the fairness of a scale at dusk. The old grammar of storm and counsel still warms the language. But the lesson is now this. Worship reaches its height when it bends down. Prophets had been saying it for years, sometimes with a gentleness that felt like cool shade, sometimes with an edge that nicked pride cleanly. Bring me not a chorus, if your hands are red. Do not tell me candles were expensive if your measures are crooked. Do not bow deeply at dawn if by noon you are trampling the poor into dust. Their sentences, once heard as interruptions, now sound like sheet music you cannot stop humming once it gets into your bones. What am I asked to bring? The people begin to ask, and the answer, again and again, refuses theatric. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. Justice, not an abstract scale held by a statue, but a decision that leaves a neighbor safe. Mercy, the choice to make room for someone who cannot repay you without calling it charity so loudly that they hear the price. Humility, the posture that remembers to be human in a world that forgets how. Imagine a morning in a rebuilt neighborhood when the last of the plaster dust has been washed from courtyards and fig trees have resumed their patient talk with sun. A dispute about a loan's terms arrives like an uninvited guest. The lender can quote law before breakfast. The debtor can quote catastrophe until supper. At the city gate, elders sit where wind can hear the arguments and not take sides. The verdict is strangely simple. The amount stands. The interest is forgiven. A year is added, not because contracts are soft, but because lives are. No one cheers. Everyone breathes. The priest, who will later lift a bowl in the sanctuary, walks home by a longer route to watch how water moves in the canal when an obstruction has been cleared. He thinks that is what mercy looks like. Nothing spectacular, just flow restored on a feast day. The pilgrim's road shines with sandals and good intentions. Baskets are full, voices are high, and children learn the choreography of belonging. At the gate, a generous man distributes alms with one eye half closed, as if giving were a performance that needed dim light to look holy. No one scolds him, but a teacher nearby opens a scroll and reads a story, where the hero is not the one who gives the most in coin, but the one who stops for a wounded stranger and loses an afternoon. The generous man lowers his hand, then raises it again with a different posture, as if remembering that attention is sometimes worth more than silver. He looks up and notices a widow whose basket is lighter than dignity prefers. He walks alongside her and does not make conversation heavy with help. Later, when the choir sings about glory, he hears it as the weight of a kindness that did not embarrass. There are days when ritual and conscience meet so seamlessly that no one can tell where one ended and the other began. A butcher turns away a hurried customer because the animal was not slaughtered with care. He loses money in the moment and gains the slow currency of trust. A vineyard owner sends his workers home early on the 7th day of harvest. Not because the quotas are met, but because rest is older than goals. A judge, offered a gift wrapped in phrasing, laughs softly and returns it with a proverb that refuses to be bought. None of this becomes a headline. All of it becomes the city's weather. Still, the heart drifts. It always does. Festivals grow ornate because human hands are clever. Prayers become fluent because tongues love music. Piety collects ornaments the way a shoreline collects shells. It is not wrong to beauty a vow. It is wrong to let beauty stand in for the vow. So teachers keep returning to the beginning. Remember that the first altar was a stone, the first sanctuary, a tent. The first command, a sentence that ordinary people could memorize while walking. If your worship makes you impressive and not kinder, you have mistaken fragrance for bread. If your doctrine makes you quick to name enemies and slow to name obligations, you have confused clarity with cruelty. The name did not carry you through exile to produce excellent pageantry. He carried you to learn a fierce gentleness with one another. A small scene by a door frame that remembers too much. A father inscribes a verse on a little tablet and nails it where hands reach without thinking. His daughter asks why words need wood, and he says, because we forget. She watches him press his fingers to the tablet each time he leaves and returns. One evening, she places her palm there herself and speaks the first line about hearing. About one, and finds the day arranges itself around that sentence as if it were a nail and she were the cloth. Later that week, she sees a boy at the well cutting the line with his jar. She does not report him. She remembers the one watches both and brings him her place in line. The well thanks her in its own language. Elsewhere, a bright young scribe, proud of his precise hand, copies a scroll and feels pleased enough to miss the point. An old woman, buying thread in the market, hears him praising his letters and interrupts with a question that takes the ambition out of his posture. Can you read it to me slowly? He does. She closes her eyes and nods at each clause, as if measuring them against the shape of the day. When he finishes, she says, "That is how I want my house to sound." The boy realizes his work is not ink, but echo. He begins again with smaller pride and larger care. And when he writes the word neighbor, he slows without deciding to. The prophet's lawsuits, those stern poems that summoned mountains as juries and named breaches of covenant without euphemism, are still read in the squares. But the ears listening have changed. Once, some heard them as performance. Now, more hear them as protection. To accuse a city of trampling the weak is to protect the city from a slow ruin that no army will have to finish. To shout against bribes is to guard the judge from becoming the sort of man who cannot look at his children without calculating. To say that the one hates robbery offered as sacrifice is to invite worshippers to bring themselves instead of their gloss. The tone can be sharp. The goal is tenderness preserved from rot. Night schools grow up beside lamps in humble rooms. Apprentices learn to plane wood straight and to plane their speech straighter. Bakers teach measurements that will not betray the hungry. Midwives rehearse the courtesy owed to life at its smallest. These lessons are liturgy. The students do not know they are worshiping because no one asks them to sing. But when a storm rips a roof from a neighbor's house, and they are the first to climb ladders with rope and counsel, the choir, if there had been one, would have marked the day with a song. There is laughter in this season, not cynicism's laugh, but the warm kind that knows how to sit with sorrow and does not mock it. A shopkeeper hangs a sign, "Fair weights, fair words." He means it as a joke, but the joke is a vow. A child quotes a law at a bully, and the bully, embarrassed by the law's calm, pretends to trip and changes the afternoon. A debtor brings the first coins of a repayment schedule arranged mercifully. The creditor hides his relief by asking, absurdly, whether the coins would like tea. He means, "I am glad we will see each other again without shame." Worship in the sanctuary notices the offerings laid down look like weeks, not like speeches. The smoke that rises smells like bread that did not lie, wine that did not cheat, oil that did not claim to be more than it was. Priests begin to bless by naming behaviors as well as blessings. May the One make you strong in kindness. May He keep you impatient with your own easy excuses. May He teach your hands to put things right before you put them away. The people say amen because they are tired of ornate wishes that do not become mourning, because we are on it. We admit how hard humility is. To walk humbly is to refuse both swagger and despair. It is to remember that you are a creature dust breathed into dignity, and that your neighbor is the same. It is to take joy in being corrected quickly, in making amends efficiently, in shutting a door on a rumor before it can change clothes and step into the street. It is to let the name be large without making yourself small in the sour way. Instead, you become precise, like a tool fitted to the work. As the year turns again, a festival arrives that once meant spectacle and now means inventory. Families sit with ledgers and memory and ask, where did we keep faith and where did we keep appearances instead? The questions do not ruin the feast, they season it. Under lantern, someone reads a line about the fast the one chooses, to loose bond, to share bread, to bring the homeless poor into your house. A murmur moves through the room like a collective promise. The door on the courtyard is left unlatched that night. Not every night can be like this. At least this one will be. Close your eyes. Let ritual rest where it belongs. An outer room that opens into a truer chamber. Feel how the old storm titles now sound like weather reports for the soul. Thunder that breaks a stubbornness. Rain that returns a field to itself. Clear sky that lets you see a neighbor's need from far off it. The council's hush remains, but it is the hush of conscience listening for a verdict already spoken. Tomorrow the market, the bench, the oven, the gate, each will ask for worship with no music. The one will answer with the same short sentence that has followed us from mountain to hill to river and home again. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly, and sleep will nod, satisfying because it understands plain speech. Wisdom grows best where certainty has learned its limits. After walls are mended and festivals find their rhythm again, questions ripen in the quiet between chores. If the one is just, why do the wicked seem weatherproof? If the world has an order, why does grief arrive early and stay late at the houses of those who pray? The old grammar story, counsel, covenant does not break under these questions. It deepens. A new room opens off the sanctuary, not a place of sacrifice, but of sentences, where proverbs sit beside lament, and both are welcomed as forms of piety. Listen first to the marketplace wisdom that mothers teach while bread swells and cools. Honest scales are the Lord's delight, a line says, as practical as a measuring cup. Answer softly. Another says, and anger will remember a different errand. These sentences fit in pockets. A boy can borrow one and spend it at the gate when a quarrel begins to collect witnesses. They do not erase storms. They teach how to walk when no wind is helping. Their confidence is not naivete. It is apprenticeship. Living rightly is a craft. And the name is the master who does not hoard his patterns. But simple tools meet complicated days. A righteous man's vineyard blights. A cruel man's wall stands. A child with clear eyes and a steady laugh is taken from a household that had finally learned to be gentle. In such time, the wisdom that works 9 days in 10 feels like a broom against rain. So the people keep another book beside the proverb, a book that refuses to smile for a camera. It begins with a good man who is not spared, and with friends who mistake speeches for medicine. They argue through afternoons that feel like winters. They say the name is just, and the man asks where that justice can be seen without squinting. The argument is pious because it does not flatter God with insincere praise. It flatters him with the respect that truth pays. When the name finally speaks, it is from the weather itself, not to explain the ledger, but to disclose the weight of being God. The voice tours a world more intricate than any theory and leaves the man convinced not that suffering was a lesson with an answer key, but that trust can be chosen without lying. The storm does not apologize. It becomes a classroom where awe and honesty are allowed to share a desk. Another voice stands in a square at dusk and sighs with cheerful despair. Meaningless, meaningless, he says, though what he means is vapor, breath, a mist that will not be held. He is not mocking piety. He is mocking the idea that you can nail life to the wall with plans. Work is good, but don't marry your soul to it. Wisdom is fine, but it will not save you from a late rain. Pleasures have their place, but they will not bargain with death. The name, he insists, is still to be feared, not because he hunts you, but because only he can teach you to receive an afternoon like a gift rather than an investment. Light your lamp. Share your bread. Let your heart be large while it is beating. Remember always, remember that breath is alone, while the wise speak in squares. Psalms keep teaching in first person. Their eye is shameless and useful. I was young, one said, and now I am old. And he reports the fidelity he has watched, like weather, the way the name has a habit of finding the poor before they vanish. Why are you cast down, O my soul? Another asks, refusing to pretend that despair is a stranger. These poems keep the storm, but they make them walk on the inside. The voice of the Lord is over the waters, one sings, and means both thunder over cedars and courage over panic. They are songs you can sing facing east or west, in exile or at home, with tears or with oil. The one who thunders now also binds up. The one who rides the clouds also lifts the needy from the ash heap. The distance between weather and neighbor closes like a well-matched seam. Lady Wisdom appears at a city gate, like a welcomed relative, no incense, no procession, only a voice that has learned firmness without volume. She says the world was measured with joy, not only with geometry, and that those who align themselves with that joy will find straightness even on crooked street. She laughs at laziness, not because harshness is holy, but because sloth steals tomorrow from the poor first. Her theology is domesticated in the best sense. She blesses kitchens where kindness is baked into bread, and markets where equity is weighed along with olives. She is storm-translated into patience. Meanwhile, scribes who survived empires with their integrity intact begin to arrange these voices so that a generation born after catastrophe will know how to inherit courage without inheriting cruelty. They set proverbs and psalms beside the long arguments and keep space for both. Blessed is the man who, and how long, O Lord. They are careful not to tidy the books until they lie. A faith that erases its questions becomes superstition with nicer clothes. The name proves large enough to be argued with and obeyed on the same morning. In households, the curriculum becomes habit. A child learns 3 lines before sleep, that the name is one, that mercy is the shape of strength, that truth is not a tool, He falls asleep a better neighbor than he was at breakfast. A girl, mending a garment for her father, hums a psalm that once steadied her mother. When the carts of a foreign army rattled the stones, the stitching becomes prayer without anyone having planned it. A widow, counting coins that do not feel sufficient, repeats a proverb about bread cast on waters, and finds herself leaving half a loaf at a neighbor's door and walking home with a lighter spine. There is laughter. Still, the clean kind that opens windows. A sage with ink on his fingers hears a young man declaim wisdom as if it were a sport and interrupts. "Try it on your wife," he says, and the courtyard blooms with knowing grin. The point is not to bruise pride. It is to plant wisdom where its roots hold marriages, markets, friendships, fences shared politely. The name is praised most responsibly in places where neighbors can argue without fear and reconcile without spectacle. Sometimes the storm returns outside, while the storm returns inside. A squall takes the city in one motion, hurling water down alleys with such delight that children decide weather has a personality. Lamps are moved back from threshold. Laughter rearranges sup, and afterward the world smells washed and electric. A man who had intended to shade his weights the next morning changes his mind. The voice over the waters has reminded him that he would rather have clean hands than clever accounts. The line between meteorology and morality thins in a way that does not insult either. And there are those late-night passages when a reader stops speaking aloud because the words have climbed into places that sound is not allowed. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, the line says, and the reader, who has been keeping his composure as a craft, allows himself to be unmade enough to be remade. He had thought holiness was polish. He discovers it is repair. He puts the scroll down and goes to bed without finishing the paragraph. In the morning, he returns a tool he borrowed permanently 3 months ago. That act is a better commentary than his notes would have been. Because we are honest, we admit that mystery grows with wisdom. The more the one is known, the less he is owned. The questions do not vanish. They change shape. Why did this happen? Becomes, how shall we live now? Where is justice? Becomes, how can I join it? The storm is not domesticated, but it is no longer the only teacher. Conscience, trained by law and songs and the long patience of daily decency, can hear the thunder, even on clear days, and answer with the only line that has ever made the weather obey. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly, close your eye. The books are still open on the table, their pages breathing slightly in the night air. Outside, a dog rearranges the silence and gives it back. A lamp guttering finds its calm. The one who has spoken from mountain and whirlwind and whisper and line of law is not finished, because people are not finished. In the next part, the lessons we have learned indoors will be carried again into the world's wide rooms, courts and caravan, borders and bedrooms, and the old titles will take one last bow as they reveal what they were always pointing toward, a goodness large enough to be justice and gentle enough to be a home. Echoes remain, even after a language learns new grammar. Storm does not retire when justice takes the bench. It changes job. Thunder becomes a commentary on conscience. Lightning becomes a picture for the kind of clarity that arrives without permission and makes a small, clean divide between before and after. The sea keeps its rumble at the edge of thought, but its menace shrinks to the size of habits that want to flood a life when vigilance sleeps. The old images, polished by many hands, are not rejected. They are recast and carried like tools that still fit the fist, now used for finer work. Walk with me through a morning whose sky is undecided. A baker measures flour with a care that would have honored any altar. He remembers a line sung last night about the voice over the waters and hears, as if from the rafters, the reminder that fairness is the quietest form of courage. His scale balances. The pans blink level like eyelids waking. A customer he does not like for reasons he cannot defend receives the same load, the same price. Thunder mutters far off. Inside, a smaller storm resentment. The oldest weather refuses to form. The cloud rider rides there. 2. In the courts, metaphors become policy. He rides upon the clouds is not merely poetry. When a judge refuses to let a bribe purchase a different outcome, it is the claim that no private weather system, money, influence, threat can roll in and drown justice. He treads the sea reeds like a procedural rule when officials design a Sabbath for servants, animals, even land. Chaos will not be permitted to grind the poor 7 days a week. The words that once crowned pageantry now govern spreadsheets. Their glory is not dimmed. It is domesticated into goodness. At festival, songs remember the mountain and the hill and the river far away. Children ask for the stories. In the way children ask for a game they already know. Delight increased, not dull, by being told again. In the retelling, thunder keeps its place, but a difference has settled over the crowd like evening cool. People no longer expect spectacle to fix their lives. They expect it to remind them who they are when the music ends. A line about the Lord of Hosts lifts an army image without summoning soldiers. Its host is the assembly of the willing, the ones who bring fairness to market and patience to quarrels and mercy to ledger. Angels still pass through the edges of scenes the way swifts cut a courtyard's afternoon. Seen enough to gladden, not enough to distract. When a story needs speed or protection, they enter, do, and leave. No one builds an altar to wings. The one keeps the center clear. A priest, preparing words, smiles at how simple the liturgy has become in old age. Name, gratitude, confession, mercy, petition, trust. The old thunder phrases are still there, but they lean now toward verbs that households can perform. Make us steadfast, he says, and ready to repair what we break. There are still rooms where the sea tries the latch. A trader returns from abroad, fluent in cynicism, and lays out charms like sweets, each promising an outcome without the cost of virtue. He laughs at do right, calls it village talk. For a season, he prospers loudly. Then a drought visits not the sky, but his friendships. Debts collect in corners. He finds himself alone in a full house one evening, walking past a gate where children are being instructed in a psalm about clean hands and hearts that do not lift themselves to lies. He feels the kind of thunder that makes a man stop and put his back to a wall. He goes home and burns a handful of charms because it is easier than apologizing. The next morning, he stands in a doorway with his hat in both hands and learns the harder fire, the one that eats pride and leaves a man able to sit again with neighbors. The storm served him. The sea receded. Scribes finish a generation's work and do something modest and immense. They set the older stories in an order that lets a reader hear the music the way it was meant. The divine counsel is not erased. It is framed so the one can be known without competition. The sea battle is not deleted. It is placed beside laws that make violence ashamed of itself. Titles like Most High and Almighty are stacked under the name, like stones that make a stair. A boy climbs them easily and finds himself saying a sentence that would have sounded like a boast once, and now sounds like a vow. One, not one against. One for the widow, for the worker, for the land that must lie down, for the stranger you would rather forget until you require a favor. A grandmother keeps a box of small, smooth stones taken from places where the family made promises. When a grandchild lies too cleverly, using truth like a stencil to paint a false picture, she opens the box and lets the child choose a stone to carry in their pocket until the weight teaches them their own. This, she says, tapping the stone, is thunder you can borrow. No one laughs. The child returns the stone a week later with a seriousness that makes the grandmother close the box silently, as if returning a lamp to its hook. A teacher takes a group of youths up a low hill that overlooks a weave of fields and paths. He tells the storm stories and then tells them what they have become. Once, he says, we needed to see fire eat wet wood to know which way to turn. Now we are asked to be fire that consumes unfairness and leaves fields unscorched. Once we needed to watch a king be corrected. Now we are asked to refuse flattery before it needs to be corrected. The same God, the same power, different place to stand. The youths who had hoped for lightning are not disappointed. They were born into a world already lit and are glad to be told where the switch is. Even the land seems to have understood. Fields left obediently unharvested at the margins grow a halo of green that belongs to those who need it. Gleaning, an old word, returns to conversation with the pleasure of a friend thought lost. A vineyard owner looks at the corners he used to shave for profit and sees, with some embarrassment, how they had pinched his heart. Letting them widen feels like taking off 2 small shoes. He quotes to himself a storm psalm voice over the waters and chuckled because he finally hears the line as irrigation. There are still arguments because time does not end. Some want more spectacle, some want none. Some say the old images should be folded away like festival garments. Others say they are the only clothes that fit. The middle learns to hold both. Let thunder sit in the background like a piano that can accompany any meal. Let conscience play the melody. On evenings when the city gathers, an old man who remembers more losses than he will name asks for the ancient line about the clouds, and a young woman who has never lived under a tyrant asks for the new line about loving mercy. The choir sings both without compromise. No one leaves hungry. A last small scene before we turn toward the end. A boy and his mother walk home after the market. It has rained precisely enough to lift the day's smell. They pass a wall where someone has carved a childish boat with a knife and a sea beneath it with more patience than talent. The mother touches the boat with 2 fingers as if to bless the mischief, then points at the gutters where water runs clear. That, she says, is what the old stories mean. Water where it belongs. Do you remember who does that? The boy nods and says the name. Then, surprising himself, he adds, unprompted, and we do, when we keep our word. He is not praised, he is agreed with. The agreement warms him more than praise would have. A thunder too small for weather rolls once in his chest and travels on, looking for another house to bless. Close your eye. The echoes are not ending. They are choosing their new room. Cloud, sea, council, mountain, they still live in the city. But they speak now as elders in kitchen, not as generals in square. The one, whose voice learned our grammar so we could survive, continues to make weather of the heart. Storms that clean, sunlight that tells the truth, rain that arrives in time. In the next part, we will ask plainly why this turn to one mattered at all, what hunger it fed in ordinary people, what coherence it offered a world stitched from imperial cloth, what courage it lent to nights when no song seemed strong enough. Then, very gently, we will let the story lie down. Why did this turning to one matter beyond poetry, beyond the pleasing symmetry of a simple sentence, begin with a problem that follows people the way their own shadow does? Life frayed, empires tug from one side, famine from another, neighbors from a third, desire from a fourth. In such crosswinds, the heart tries to lash itself to anything that looks steady, chart, tribe, cleverness, and finds each rope slips sooner or later. Many small gods fit that uncertainty. They are negotiable, rentable, adjusted to moods, but a will that is one and good does something none of the smaller ropes can manage. It gathers a person into one piece. You are not one person on feast days and another at market, not one in the temple and another at the gate. The same voice that thunders over the waters speaks over the scale. The same hand that led through a sea steadies a pen as it signs mercy where interest would have paid. Wholeness is the gift. Coherence opens courage. When you no longer spend your mornings sorting which patron to flatter for rain, and which to please for fertility, and which to avoid, lest he foul a journey, you have hours back for the work of kindness. The old storm words become permission to be brave without theater. He rides the clouds means you do not need to ride your neighbor. He treads the sea means you do not need to drown a rival to keep your head above water. The market senses the difference long before scribes do. Bread sold by someone who fears one is heavier in the hand. Promises given by someone who remembers one are less likely to break at the hinge. And then there is grief, which is where most theologies either grow honest or grow brittle. Many gods can entertain a wedding. Only one can hold a funeral without lying. When a child is buried and the world does not end to honor the day, a woman finds that prayers to specialists are intolerable. She does not want a charm. She wants a character, someone to whom you can say, this is wrong, and not be scolded for impoliteness. The God who speaks in covenants answers grief not with quick repairs, but with presence and a long insistence that justice will have the last word. In houses where sorrow sits, the line about one is not recited as doctrine. It is rocked like an infant until both the line and the rocker have calmed. Monotheism did something to time. 2. In a world of many patrons, the calendar becomes a roster of appeasement. In a world held by one, Sabbath arrives like a rightful interruption. Rest no longer depends on a mood. It is an obedience that composes the week. Servants rest because the one who made time said so. Animals rest because the one delights in mercy that includes creatures. Land rests because even soil is not a machine. An empire that turns men into hours cannot understand such law. A people who keep it discover that dignity does not need a throne to wear a crown. Sabbath teaches that freedom is not a feeling, but a schedule. The turn to one also turned neighbors into something sturdier than ally. Many gods divide responsibility and allow compassion to remain provincial. My shrine, my kin, my street. A single will for good refuses that bargain. If the one is maker of the ends of the earth, then the stranger at your gate is not an intrusion, but an appointment. The old stories tie this claim to biography. You were strangers once, the law says, and memory becomes ethic. It is hard to keep hatred tidy when your own grandparents' dust still clings to a road they were forced to walk. Under one, a circle expands until it embarrasses our favorite borders. Not all obey. Enough do that the poor learn to show up without shame. Kings felt the pressure of one as well. Under many gods, a throne can shop for legitimacy. Under one, a throne is audited. Prophets walk into palaces with sentences like tools, plumb-line, scale, measuring rod. A king who has learned to fear and hears those tools on his own soul first and breathes easier, not because he is soft, but because he has been spared the ruin of believing he's the weather. A nation led by such a man is not safe from war or drought. It is safer from becoming the kind of place that loses its name while keeping its map. The household felt it most concretely. Domestic piety lamp, little plaques. Small vows did not disappear. It clarified. A mother could teach her children a single blessing that covers bread and truth. A father could discipline without humiliation because authority was borrowed and accountable. Quarrels traveled a shorter distance to peace because the court at the city gate and the court in the conscience carried the same law. A festival became an audit. Where have we done justice? Where have we loved mercy? Where have we walked humbly? And joy came cleaner because it did not have to drown out omissions nobody intended to fix. The turn to one also kept memory safe from flattery. Many gods invite you to edit your past until you look like a hero, and the poor look like scenery. The one insists on the full record. You were slave. The story says plainly, and I took you out. That sentence prevents nostalgia from becoming a shrine. It prevents prosperity from rebranding theft as skill. It keeps songs from turning victories into excuses for future cruelty. Under one, confession becomes a habit that strengthens spines instead of bending them. A gentler gift may be the strangest. Attention. To believe in one is to live as if reality is not a room you shout into, hoping an interested power is within earshot, but a presence that already listens. The line about ears not stopped and eyes that see is not only a polemic against carved mouths and blind idols. It is a balm for ordinary loneliness. The tent breather of the wilderness does not become bored by city. He hears the widow's small prayer about a roof tile and the judge's large fear about a case he cannot solve without losing a friend. In both rooms, the same calm arrived. You are seen. Do right. There were costs, of course. The old domestic helpers did not vanish without tugging on strings wrapped around grief and habit. Some rituals ended because they had become disguises for control. Some ended because their time had simply passed. Families argued, not always kindly, but the bargain proved sound. Fewer altars, more justice, fewer patrons, more integrity, fewer bargains, more rest. The city that learned to say one did not become perfect. It became possible to keep promises in drought, to repair trust after war, to welcome those who sang with different vowels and still be itself. Stand, then, in the square at dusk, as lamps turn the air amber, and hear a scribe read a line you could almost recite with him. Besides me, there is no other. Listen for how the crowd receives it, not as a shout over neighbors, but as a vow under which to live. No other, says the line. And you hear, do not build your days on what cannot love you back. No other, says the line. And you hear, you may stop auditioning for smaller thrones. You are free to do right without calculating favor. Free to love mercy without asking who will notice. Free to walk humbly because the one who sees is not fragile. Why did the turn to one matter? Because it took the sky's grammar cloud, thunder, sea, and translated it into a life strong enough for ordinary decency. Because it turned worship from a portfolio into a posture. Because it gathered a people out of the noise of empire and taught them to breathe together. Because it made room in the world for a sentence short enough to memorize and large enough to live inside. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. In that sentence, the storm still speaks, but softly now, the way a parent whispers when the child finally begins to sleep. Close your eyes. The lamps are steady. The stones remember both hammers and songs and refuse to hold a grudge. Somewhere a gate creaks and then decides to be quiet. Let the one hold the night while you lay down your many cell. In the morning, you will only need one of you, the one that keeps promises when no one is looking, because someone is. A story grows upright when its roots are tended after centuries of tents and tablets, storms and sentences. The people who say the name learn a last hard art. How to keep a covenant without confusing it for offense. The world beyond their hills does not stand still. New empires rise with libraries tall as confident, roads laid like argument, coins pressed with kings who want to be time. Tongues mingle in markets. Ideas travel on faster shoes. Some fear dilution and tighten their words until they squeak. Others learn to hold their vowels steady while their neighbors speak in new consonant. The one does not shrink in translation. He stands behind it like meaning behind metaphor. In a port city where warehouses smell of cedar and salt, a teacher unrolls a scroll for students who were born under foreign flags but dream in their grandparents' stories. He reads the Shema, the old hymn in their household tongue, and then in the newer one they use to buy figs. The line is not a museum piece. It is a key turn-in, and the room opens in any language. The boy's shoulders fall into a listening posture, older than the street and newer than the morning. The girls keep threading reeds into mats, while their mouths keep time with the words. A passerby pauses, hears a monotheism that does not hiss at neighbors, and moves on. Quieted at the city gate, a magistrate trained in foreign law hears a case about a widow whose boundary stone is inched the wrong way. He quotes statutes that an empire respects, and then, without changing tone, quotes a line from a psalm about not moving ancient markers. The mixture does not dilute, it clarifies. The verdict lands like rain. The stone returns. The neighbor pays a token that is more apology than fine. Observers mutter that this is how thunder sounds in a civilized tongue. No one applauds. The widow goes home with the kind of gratitude that does not need a choir. In the sanctuary, scholars who have counted years learn to count meanings. They edit with reverence, not to tame the text, but to keep its spine straight. They bind together the scrolls that sing and argue and remember, so that a child, opening to any page, will find the same God storm-sure, covenant stubborn, tender with bruised things. They do not erase the hard poems that summon mountains as witnesses or the soft ones that say a shepherd carries lambs close. They place them where they can correct each other in our hearing. Holiness keeps both edges, the one that cuts hypocrisy and the one that trims sorrow into something that can fit back into life. When foreign philosophers wander through and talk about reason with a capital letter, some ears perk. Reason, they say, orders the cosmos and gives it a grammar the mind can learn. A scribe nods and replies that his people have been trained to love order too, but that for them, order is always married to goodness, and goodness to mercy. Your reason could be admired without being obeyed, he says gently. Our one is love, and so we obey him, though not as quickly as we should. The visitors smile, intrigued by the way law and affection have been braided. Later, in their writing, they will remember a peculiar virtue in that port. The way justice there felt warmer than logic alone could make it. At a feast, an argument starts that will never finish. How much of the older domestic piety belongs in a world so wide? One man misses charms the way exiles miss the smell of a particular oven. Another, freshly convinced by the prophet, wants to strip piety down to its bare grammar. Love, neighbor. A woman who has kept a household's health through 3 famines and 1 war. Pours wine and says the line that keeps both from hardening. Keep the stones that taught you to stand, but don't trip on them. They laugh, relief like a roof. The lamps burn lower, and the room feels held by sentences rather than defended by them. In a workshop where leather is cut to the shape of usefulness, a father teaches his son the difference between edge and wound. A good knife, he says, finishes a job without drawing blood. He quotes a proverb his own father used when anger turned his voice into a blade. The boy nods and learns a skill you cannot see: how to set down a sharp word. Because the neighbor in front of you is not a problem to be solved, but a life to be kept whole. Later that week, in the market, he does not win an argument he could have won. He wins a friend instead. The old storm has become a steady hand. There is another lesson. Patience has time to teach how to carry certainty without letting it bruise strangers. When pilgrims come from far roads with different rituals in their pockets, the city remembers that the one who taught them justice taught them hospitality in the same breath. Gatekeepers trained to spot trouble are also trained to spot need. A family is given a fair place to sleep. A child is given a sweet and a sentence about kindness as if the two were the same food. The mother, unsettled by such unadvertised welcome, asks why. The answer is not a treatise, because we were strangers too. Someone says, as if admitting a scar that has become an inheritance. Sometimes the old fear wakes. A governor issues a decree that smells like flattery to power and fear of difference. In the square, respectable men begin to calculate what they can keep if they comply. That night, a teacher opens a scroll and reads a story in which 3 youths refuse to bow to a very shiny statue. Speaking to a king with good grammar and better courage, he closes the scroll and does not multiply a commentary. He says only, "Tomorrow we will open our shops at the same hour, with the same weight." He is not starting a movement. He is guarding a memory. The next day, enough shutters lift that the decree looks smaller than it wanted to be. Letters trap, because wisdom likes to stretch its leg. A community a week's walk away writes that they are tired. Tired of doing right without applause. Tired of mercy that seems to attract more need. Tired of humility that goes unnoticed. The reply is an old sentence wearing a new shawl. Do not grow weary in well-doing. A proverb is added like bread for the road. If you fall 7 times, rise 8. Beneath both lies the bedrock the letters share. One sees, keep going. The travelers who carry these lines roll them up carefully against sweat and weather. The words arrive creased but unbroken, like hope. In houses where children ask big questions with crumb-streaked cheeks, why didn't God stop that? Why are we smaller than empire? Parents learn to answer without lying. I don't know, they say. And then they add what they do. We will do right. We will love mercy. We will walk humbly. Today, the children do not find this evasive. They find it actionable. One picks up a broom big enough for 2 hands and makes a clean stripe down a dirty floor. He calls it prayer and is not corrected. At funeral, the line about one grows heavier and kinder. Mourners speak the name as if it were a door left open in a house too quiet. Prayers do not pretend that death is reasonable. They announce that love is stubborn. A psalm about walking through shadowed valleys is sung by voices that crack. The cracking is part of the song's design. Later, in kitchen, the mourners eat in grateful silence, while a neighbor fixes a hinge that has squealed for a year. Small repairs become sacraments. The world inches back toward use. On clear nights, scholars sit on roofs and read the heavens as if they were commentary. The sky tells glory, one quotes, and the others nod, glad to hear a familiar line speak without being tired. They talk about the temptation to build new councils for the modern mind committees of forces with grand names. And they agree to stay with simplicity. There is law in these lights, another says, and also music. The one holds both. They fall asleep where they sit, scrolls collapsing like tents. In the morning, a neighbor laughs and covers them with a blanket. The way one covers arguments, one has decided to love instead of win. A final small day before we let the story rest. A girl stands at the threshold of the home she is leaving to make a home of her own. She places her palm on the little tablet by the door and whispers the old line about one. Her mother, who has avoided speeches all week so as not to fill this hour with her own weather, adds a sentence. Let your kindness be heavier than your certainty. The girl smiles. The brave smile people wear when love is the reason for change, and steps into a street that smells like bread and dust and the faint iron of an honest life. The sky is quiet, which is its way of saying yes. Close your eyes. The tents are folded. The altars smoke softly. The courts and kitchens and markets hum with the same sentence in different keys. Cloud, sea, council, mountain, none were wasted. They taught a people to hear the one in thunder, and then in law, and then in conscience, and finally in the ordinary mercy that keeps a city from fray. If you need a last line to sleep by, use the one that has walked with us from the first wind to this quiet room. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly, the rest is weather, this is home. The story's endurance can be measured by what it makes of small hours. Long after palaces trade names and armies forget their own songs, a people wakes before light, and the quiet between lamp and dawn becomes a room for the one. A mother murmurs the line that begins with her sharis, not for ceremony, but so that the day will have a spine. A father puts his thumb on the little tablet by the door until the wood warms and his posture changes. Children must be persuaded out of sleep, and breakfast requires the domestic alchemy of heat and patience. None of this is dramatic. All of it is worship. A city that learned to call God one now learns to be one city, stitched from kitchens at the gate. Commerce starts with greetings that are more than politeness. Peace, someone said, and means both a wish and a reminder. Do not let profit teach you a different grammar. The market retains its noise. Goats insist on their commentary. Scales clink like small bells. Bargaining rises and falls like weather. But under it runs a bass note. The ear can learn to trust. You can tell, without looking too hard, where the name has been taken seriously. Corners of fields are not shaved into meanness. Weights wear honest wear. Debt has a path out besides shame. In schools where letters are taught with the gravity of seed. A teacher lets the class recite a law and then asks the question. Ritual was always meant to provoke. What would this look like at the well? What would this cost you at noon? The children answer with inventions that sound like proverbs, borrowed from tomorrow. A shy girl says she would step back from the mouth of the cistern if a stranger arrived, even if her jar had not filled. A boastful boy caught, smiling. In his own weather claims, he would sell his sweetest figs at the same price to a foreigner and a friend. The room laughed, not at the boy, but with him, because this is how courage learns to like itself. In small, rehearsed decency, letters go out from this city toward others that have learned their own ways of reverence. Some are written in the old tongue, some in the lingua franca that lets far ports share figs and news, some in a local dialect that feels like home, even when spoken by strangers. All carry a pulse steady enough to be recognized across distance. The one is not a shrine to be defended. He is a character to be imitated, where the letters land. They cause no scandal unless fairness is scandal, and mercy a public disturbance. Elders in those towns read them aloud and nod. They know the taste of rest in a world that measures worth in tiredness. There are still processions. Festivals have not been retired to memory any more than mountains have. On certain evenings, the city glows with oil and remembers deliverance with bread that snaps like a good promise and wine that tastes like a kept one. Children ask the questions the feast requires, and the answers come in lines sized for small mouths. We were slaved. We were brought out. We were given a law that turns neighbors into kin. Thunder is not banished from the liturgy. It bows its head. The storm has become an accompanist, happy to be useful. Scholars continue their precise kindness. In quiet rooms with careful light, they bind the arguments and songs into an order that helps the inattentive become attentive again. They write marginal notes that do not bully the text, but stand beside it like gentle elders, pointing. They keep both the brightness and the bruised psalms that shout joy high and laments that do not surrender vocabulary to despair. They are not trying to freeze a tradition. They are trying to keep it warm through long winters when they are done. The book wills itself into memory the way a melody does. Beyond the city, roads run like veins. To other places where different divine names are spoken with earnest hearts, trade and talk happen on the same cart. A merchant from one of those towns, weary of clever gods who eat coin and give philosophy, lingers at the gate here and listens to law being read without theatrics. He notices how it lands, not as a threat, not as a dare, but as a shape for ordinary days to fit. He stays 3 extra nights and watches the way disputes end, less like victory and defeat, more like a field brought back into line after a flood. He does not convert. He learns when he leaves. He quotes a stolen proverb to himself like a charm. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. It works better than charms. When storms do come in the sky or in the street, they find a people practiced at standing together. A caravan fails to return. A price of oil climbs like a rumor. An empire with tidy roads and impolite policies tightens a border that was previously a shrug. Panic does what it does. And then, because practice changes reflex, calm does its quieter work. Granaries open without speeches. Leaders read law in the square and ask for the behaviors that drain chaos. Households that once kept charms in flower jars keep flour there instead and share it. A city cannot prevent weather. It can decide what weather can prevent. There are failures. A judge forgets his oath and remembers his cousin. A moneylender wraps cruelty in paper and calls it prudence. A priest lets ritual become costume. The failure is not the end. It is the beginning of repair's death. Neighbors speak before rumors can sharpen themselves. Restitution is arranged before dignity is too injured to accept it. A scribe with hands too clean to know the world's texture goes to fetch a bucket and learn. Finally, the weight of water at night. One of the offenders alone, hungry for forgiveness, that will not humiliate, says only the name and the sentence it learned to carry. And sleep answers with the forgiveness that comes before the apology it requires. Now and then, strangers arrive who carry questions sharper than respect. They ask whether one is a boast disguised as humility, whether law is kindness in formal dress, or an instrument the strong use to keep their grip. The city has answers prepared, but it often prefers invitations. Come weigh, a merchant says, pointing to his scale. Come listen, a magistrate says, pointing to a bench. Come eat, a widow says, pointing to a table set to feed two more than she has food for. If the strangers accept, their questions do not shrink. They take off their armor. The conversation improves. A generation passes, then another. The names of kings turn into the kind of trivia that only schoolboys and bored soldiers remember. Holidays keep their months by cooperation, not compulsion. Granaries do their honest arithmetic. Courts do their. Children who once recited law by rote now explain it for the pleasure of making meaning, travel from mouth to ear with no spillage. They draw the sea on scraps, as children always will, and then draw a boundary beside it, 2 lines. Carefully parallel and label it with a word they have learned to love: justice. Those who keep account of such things notice that piety no longer needs an audience to be itself. In shops where bargains bend, agreements are made not because someone is watching, but because someone is. In alleys where trouble will always look for shadow, hands that once reached for stones now reach for a shoulder, steering conflict toward daylight. In bedrooms where shame and tenderness live like poor relatives, spouses learn the art of honesty that does not expose more than it heals. None of this makes a parade. All of it makes a city livable. Sometimes the old images knock politely on the door to be let in. A child asks to hear the story of the hill with the fire, and an elder tells it with the urgency softened, the lesson sharpened. How the flame ate wet wood and then went to work inside laws and habits until bribes smoked and were done. Another asks for the mountain where voice and stone met, and the telling comes with a smile. How thunder learned grammar and walked down as you shall, not to bind joy, but to anchor it. The children fall asleep with their mouths open, the way sleepers do when weather has finally changed and windows can stay open through the night. The elders fall quiet in the relief of having remembered rightly. If you ask what remains after this many pages, the answer refuses ornament. The one who once met a people in the dramatics of weather and the logistics of wilderness has written his titles into tissue. Conscience, custom, habit, hope. The sea still speak, but it is a rumor from far off. Near at hand, the danger is always the smaller flood greed. Fear, vanity, and the remedy is the same as it ever was. Truth and mercy, stroked into shape by humility. Angels still keep their errands. Counsels still appear in poems when the heart needs a balcony from which to see itself. But the center, which was always the center, stands one who hears, who remembers, who judges without being purchased, who prefers repair to theater, who rides any sky and yet is at home in kitchens. The city sleeps. A pot cools, a hinge settles, a dog contradicts the silence and then agrees with it. On a rooftop, an old man who has long since forgotten the number of festivals he has kept holds out his hands to the night, palms up. An instinct older than scrolls. He says the name in a voice the dark does not mind. And he adds nothing fancy, only the sentence we have carried like a lamp through this whole road. In the morning, he will rise and keep it again, unastonished, grateful. For now, The words lie down beside him, and the night, which has heard other things, prefers these. Dawn is a craftsman who prefers repetition to surprise. It lays the same light on the same lintels, and people take the hint. Faithfulness is mostly tools picked up again. In the centuries that follow, the people who say the name learn to build rooms where distance can't unteach devotion. A house on a corner becomes a house of meeting. A bench becomes a study. A table becomes a map of the world with bread at its center. They call these rooms for gathering by a word that means assembly, not spectacle. There is no altar here, only a book that is also a chorus. Old stories are read until they become lenses. Laws are chanted until they become muscle memory. A child who cannot reach the shelf can still reach the sentence about loving the stranger. He carries it home like a found coin. On market days in harbor towns, where ships from 5 languages tangle their ropes, buyers and sellers learn to treat fairness as a dialect that needs no translation. A butcher answers a question about price with a proverb. A cloth merchant refuses a flattery that would end in theft. A sailor watches the scale settle and says, "Admire, your God must be nearby." He keeps close, the shopkeeper answers, meaning no offense. When a storm delays departure, the city's elders open a hall and lay out simple food. Refuge is not a project, it is a reflex. The youngest helper pours water into cups with both hands and recites, under breath and without thinking, the line that begins with "here." In courts, where empire's law and covenant's conscience meet, judges learn to bray. They cite codes whose seals impress governors, and then lean on psalms whose cadences impress hearts. A case about an abandoned field is settled with respect for ownership and for the ancient right of gleaning. A quarrel about a contract is cooled by the reminder that the borrower is a neighbor first, a debtor second. The clerk who records the verdicts has noticed a phrase that returns like a refrain, "that your brother may live with you." It is written so often that his hand shortens the motion to save ink and time. He thinks about the sentence when he goes home and finds his daughter feeding a stray dog as if the paper had published his address. In the learning houses, scholars travel without moving. They stack the old poems beside new perplexities and listen until the seam between them disappears. A teacher draws a simple ladder in wax. Justice at the bottom rung, mercy in the middle, humility at the top. He tells the class that you must step on each to reach the next, and that stepping down is not failure, but balance. A clever boy asks what sits above humility. Gratitude. The teacher says, and wipes the ladder with the flat of his hand so that the rungs blur into a field. The children laugh and forget, and then remember when a neighbor lends them a jar without asking for it back by sundown. Neighbors from other nations come and go. They bring gods with clever stories and laws with admirable neatness. They stay for a season in rooms rented from widows who manage their grief with bread and the discipline of clean courtyards. Some visitors leave with a new respect for a piety that prefers decent accounting to impressive trance. A few stay and learn to say the name without letting it become a password. They keep their accent, which the city accepts, the way it accepts weather as a feature, not a fault. There are arguments, some so sharp that they require a Sabbath to cool. The arguments are not considered failure. The failure would be silence. Empires do what empires do. Census, tax, bill, flatter, forget. The people who say, one, do what they have learned. Keep Sabbath, keep truth, keep corners of fields unshaved, keep promises, even when the person who received them has moved away. In some season, power looks on this stubbornness with suspicion and paints it as defiance. In others, power recognizes a civic asset and protects what it cannot understand. Either way, the habit holds. A governor announces a policy that would monetize kindness. The city replies by treating kindness as unpurchasable. Coin loses, the poor win. The market carries on with a shrug humans invented to survive kings. At funerals, psalms carry more than voices. Teach us to number our days, someone reads. And the community hears the mathematics of mercy, not dread. He heals the brokenhearted, another reads. And no one rushes past the line as if it were a claim to be defended rather than a comfort to be tried. In kitchens heavy with the smell of oil and onions, a widow tells a story of a winter when neighbors left grain at her door and pretended not to see her. The name was in their hand, she says, not as metaphor, but as measurement. Children rehearse history as if adjusting a lamp's wick. Egypt, the mountain, the hill with the wet wood, the river in exile, the rebuilding. The books that argue kindly in the same binding, each is named not only so the past will be remembered, but so that the future will not be invented by fear. A boy asks why the old counsels are still in the book, if the one speaks alone now. His mother answers that some pictures are kept to prevent pride, and some to prevent forgetting the debts we owe to neighbors' metaphors. Also, she adds, smiling, angels make good stories when days are long. A craftsman carving a lintel for a new doorway pauses to steady his hands and recites a line about not placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. He has carved hundreds of doorways. The line keeps him from rushing the last pass where splinters like to hide. He imagines a stranger's palm finding only smooth wood and feels a pleasure that no chorus could improve. When he hangs the piece and steps back, he notices that the sun has chosen to bless his geometry without being asked. He does not call this miracle. He calls it agreement. Every so often, the city is asked to choose between safety and its own soul. A decree arrives, signed by a distant seal. Close your doors to strangers for a season that will lengthen. Tighten your scales to save grain. Move the stones of your fields. 2 fingers toward the center. The arguments for compliance are tidy. Sincere, persuasive. The elders read the law aloud in the square without comment. Care for the stranger. Fair weights. Do not move ancient markers. The next morning, doors are open. Scales sit level. Stones keep their address. A few suffer for it. Many benefit. The city decide. In that unvoted way cities have, that being itself is the safest policy it can afford. In old age, a priest who has forgotten many names remembers recipes for blessing. He raises his hands and speaks fewer words than he once did. He blesses children with strength for gentleness, workers with patience for precision, judges with a fear of their own cleverness, widows with friends who will carry silence without filling it. When he says the name, he hears a thunder he has not heard since he was a boy, and then recognizes that it is only his own blood. He smiles at the knowledge and leans more heavily on mercy in the second line. The choir, which has learned to sing around frailty, meets his breath where it begins rather than where it ought to be, on a roof at dusk. A grandfather and a granddaughter watch swifts cut the air into fast, precise handwriting. He tells her the story of the sea as chaos and the cloud as chariot. She listens and then asks, practical as bread, how those old pictures help with the girl in her class who steals and cries when confronted. He answers in the new grammar the old pictures taught. Set the boundary clearly. Tell the truth kindly. Stand near enough to be asked for help. And the storm, she asks, with the half smile of one who still wants weather. Inside, he says, touching her forehead gently. Let it clear the air without tearing the house. A final season arrives in which nothing is final. The city, older than anyone it contained, carries its sentences like a spine. Outsiders call this resilience. Insiders call it the habit of the name. In the registry, children are still being recorded with names that tie them to old titles and new hopes. In ledgers, debts are marked and paid in a handwriting that looks relieved. In margins of books copied for the next town, a scribe writes a small note to the unknown reader. May your justice be warm and your mercy exact. The note survives the journey and is read in a room that smells like unfamiliar spices. The reader smiles at being addressed by a stranger who trusted the future. If you put your ear to the city at night, you can still hear the original grammar running under everything. The councils hush. The sea tamed to irrigation. The clouds' weight felt and conscient. The mountain's voice condensed into you shall. None of it is loud anymore. All of it is true. The one, who never competed for space because he owns all of it, continues to make a home in kitchens, benches, bedside, benches of judges, benches in school, benches that face the sea and wait for weather and suns. The sentence that carried the story from tents to tablets to towns remains short enough to whisper without waking the child who has finally fallen asleep beside you. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly, close your eye. The room is simple, a lamp, a book, a door that fits. Outside, wind edits the leaves. Inside, breath keeps time. Say the name once. The way you say here when someone you love calls and you want them to know you are not far. Let the old thunder answer by becoming quiet. Morning will come with its lists. The one will meet them with his. Between the two, you will find enough goodness to keep a covenant without building a fence. Cities are made of errands. Holiness is what errands become when they are done with clean hands. In a lane that remembers many mornings, a woman leaves bread at a neighbor's door and does not knock because she knows the dignity of quiet gifts down the way. A mason repairs a crack that has learned to call itself a pattern and brushes dust from the sill as if honoring a small altar. A boy who has read too many arguments about greatness walks a younger child to school and carries the child's slate as if he were transporting law itself. None of them would name these things worship. The one does, because he recognizes his own handwriting when it appears in gestures. News arrives the way it always does, on foot, late, with a flavor of exaggeration. An empire 2 horizons away insists that all people are the same if you teach them to be useful, which means to be quiet. The city listens without panicking. It knows its catechism. Use does not determine value, breath does. Officials come and go with rules as tidy as their sandals. The city meets them with patience and bread and an unwillingness to let fear write its ethics. When asked to bow to clever statues, it bows instead to the work of its day and calls that obedience to the One. The statues are confused, as statues often are. They were made for applause, not for being ignored. At the study bench, a teacher sets down 2 pebbles and tells a small parable. This one is certainty, he says. Touching the first, this one is curiosity. He asks which builds a city. The students answer with confidence. Certainty. He smiles and moves the pebbles closer until they touch. Together, he says. Certainty lays stones. Curiosity checks the plumb. A girl who thinks in pictures imagines the council of heaven now as craft, not debate. Angels measuring, winds drying mortar, words carrying water to thirsty sentences. She goes home and asks her mother if the neighbor who steals figs can be taught, and her mother says, "Teach him before you accuse him." That is harder, which is why it is holy. Markets remain the city's liturgy. A trader from far coasts tests the honesty of a scale with a coin and finds it level when favor would have made sense. He laughs and buys more than he needs in gratitude. A widow haggles loudly because dignity prefers to pay, and the shopkeeper enjoys the theater precisely because it ends in a price fair enough to keep both in friendship. Above the stall, a scrap of law is painted along a beam. Do not put a stumbling block before the blind, and the painters have added a small joke. A step painted bright so that no one sighted or not will miss it. Laughter becomes policy. Policy becomes kindness. On festival nights, the lamps dream in rows. The old stories are taken down and dusted with breath. We were slaves, someone says, and the sentence does its annual work of preventing pride from building a monument to itself. We were let out, another says, and gratitude keeps the memory from souring. Children ask what the thunder sounded like and are told that it sounded like law learning to love. They fall asleep before the last song and are carried home the way promises are carried carefully, with the future wrapped in them. There is a season when rain forgets, as rain will. Cisterns chide with their echo. The city responds without inventing a crisis. Fast first, then open storehouses, pray quietly, then cancel interest for a time. In the square, no one performs despair. They read a psalm about a tree planted by water. It cannot see and decide to imitate it. When rain returns, no one claims credit. Some claim responsibility, which is more like truth. Children run in gutters, and the old men let their sandals be splashed as if blessing ran both directions. A traveler arrives with questions that sparkle like coins. If your God is one, he asks, why are there so many ways to pray to him? Hear songs from one hill, proverbs from another, arguments stitched from many hands. A scribe answers by opening a book that has learned to sing harmony with itself. This is one voice, he says, the way a family is one, anger and mercy, warning and comfort. None of them are strangers. They are rooms in the same house. The traveler nods, not convinced so much as disarmed, and stays long enough to fail at bargaining in a market where failure is how friendship starts. Courts keep their small courage. A boy who broke another boy's cart is brought before elders who know the price of wood and pride. They assign repair, not punishment. Tools, not shame. The boys work side by side under a tree that has supervised penance for years, and the repaired cart carries more than goods when it leaves. It carries the boy's laughter, which costs more and pays longer. Nearby, a woman swears too carefully about land she wishes to annex. A judge hears the care and quotes a law about not stretching your truth like a rope to pull a stone. The woman blushes and retreats with dignity intact. Law has learned to be surgical. There are stumbles that do not make the book, but that keep the city honest. A priest forgets a name mid-blessing and rests in silence longer than comfort allows. The people do not prompt him, they wait, because waiting is also prayer. A money changer miscounts in his own favor, realizes at night, and returns the next morning with a difference and a proverb to cover his embarrassment. Better a poor man with straight hands, he says, and the customer laughs because she had already decided to forgive him. The exchange becomes a story told at dinners where wine loosens tongues the right amount. In the learning rooms, a young scholar grows enamored with a foreign system that claims to explain everything with fewer words. He brings it to the table with the zeal of a convert. The elders listen because listening is policy. And then one asks a single question. Where does your system put the widow? The young man opens his mouth and then closes it. Chasten. He does not discard the new tools. He learns to use them on wood that already has a grain. Later, he writes a commentary in which foreign clarity and local compassion keep each other from becoming vices. A child brings home an injured bird and lays it in a basket with the seriousness of a priest. The father, who has opinions about animals and houses, considers the mess and the lesson and chooses the lesson. He quotes a line about the one noticing the life of small things and helps the child set the basket where night will be kind. The bird recovers enough to be ungrateful and flies away without ceremony. The child cries anyway and is comforted without a lecture. The father repairs the basket and sets it near the door, as if expecting holiness to arrive disguised as inconvenience. When strangers sit at the city's edges and wonder what the secret is, the answer they overhear is not a secret. We keep the sentence short. A woman says at a well, handing her place forward, we do not love it with our mouths only. We let it cost us. She does not notice she has said anything unusual. The bucket goes down and comes up. The day keeps its appointments. The sentence keeps the day. At evening, an old pair of friends walk the wall and count roofed, a game they have played since they were boys. One says, we have not had a prophet in our time. The other says, maybe we have had too many for us to notice. They stand silent, listening for thunder that does not come. Instead, a small wind moves the tree that leans over the gate, and a daughter scolds her father gently for forgetting his cloak. And a judge leaves his bench with nothing in his pockets but a crumb someone pressed there. And a shopkeeper rubs chalk from his fingers and smiles as if forgiven. The friends stop their counting. I see. The first says, I hear. The second answers. They turn for home the long way. Sleep arrives as a friend. Rooms settle. The book is closed, but not finished. The little tablet near the door keeps its watch with a sentence that has proven stronger than moods. Somewhere a baby wakes and is sung back into trust with a line about one, because even an infant can be told what the world is made of. Somewhere a widow smiles in her sleep, because she has learned that mercy can be exact without being cruel. Somewhere a man who once loved cunning more than truth rolls over and dreams of scales that sit level, and in the dream he is not afraid. Close your eye. The grammar has done its work. Storm into law, law into conscience, conscience into habit, habit into hope. The one has learned our hours. We have learned his. If there is more to tell, it will be told in the same small ways tomorrow. A boundary set back to honesty, a debt forgiven, a hand lifted from a pocket to a shoulder instead. Say the name as you dim the lamp. The night knows it already. The morning knows what to do with it when it comes. Night leaves quietly when it knows it is welcome to return. Morning comes with an inventory that is as old as promise. Bread to be made, disputes to be cooled before they heat, a threshold to be swept so that welcome has room to stand. A woman checks the jar with the habitual anxiety of those who have known thin seasons and finds enough. She says the name without ceremony, as one writes received on a ledger that no one audits but God. A man reviewing accounts pauses when a sum would benefit from the fog of approximation. He becomes precise instead, not to prove virtue to an audience, but because he prefers to sleep. A child pauses at the little tablet by the door and discovers she now knows the first line without looking. She does not tell anyone. The line has already told her what to do. At the gate, a minor affair waits for judgment that will not be dramatic. Two neighbors have allowed a boundary to drift because talk grew more expensive than quiet. The elders let each speak without squashing truth into speed. An old proverb is quoted and allowed to do its work. Do not move the ancient market, the men nod, because the sentence has the dignity of something that existed before their impatience. Stones are set back to where memory says they belong. There is no cheering. Both men are a little disappointed that the day will not turn into a story about their cleverness. They go home relieved and will not notice until later that their children are kinder at supper because the air has fewer arguments in it. In the market, a stall keeper with a reputation for calculation is rehearsing a new way of being. He tells himself he will count the cost of honesty for 1 week as an experiment and then decide if decency pays. By midday, he has lost a little coin and gained a conversation with a widow who would not meet his eyes last month. By evening, he is surprised to be less tired. He suspects the secret is not spiritual, but physiological. He is wrong. He closes his stall and counts slower than usual on purpose, savoring the fact that his hands do not feel like tools he borrowed from his worst self. At home, he touches the tablet and says the short line, not because he believes in magic, but because the sentence has proven, empirically, to make him someone he recognizes. A caravan arrives from a place where the sea draws a straighter horizon. The travelers spill salt air and new ideas in the same breath. They carry medicines that smell like an argument and stories about philosophers who debate the shape of virtue as if it were a statue being carved from marble. The city listens because the city prefers learning to flatter it. A physician tries a salve on a child's rash and admits to hope. A teacher notes a clever syllogism and writes it in the margin near a proverb that says the same with fewer steps. At twilight, under the soft tyranny of oil lamp, 2 guests argue kindly with a local scribe about whether justice is an ideal or a habit. "Bo," the scribe says, pouring wine. But ideals that don't become habits become excuses. No one wins. Everyone sleeps well. There is a room at the edge of town where people read law aloud on purpose to see if they still believe it when the words turn back into chores. A line about releasing debts in a certain year is recited, and a farmer who has been nursing a grievance as if it were an heir, like a door that has just remembered how to move. He does not rip up the note he holds on a neighbor. He puts it in a box, and the box on a high shelf, and tells himself he will wait for the proper season. The waiting is already a kind of obedience. The high shelf is mercy's rehearsal. When the year arrives, he will open the box with the clumsy pride of a man who is surprised to find himself decent. Not all days keep their promises. A cart overturns near the well because the axle had been telling the truth and no one listened. A child is bruised. A jug shatters. A man shouts a curse he learned in a port where curses are a dialect. The square stills, then motion returns with purpose. A midwife, who has delivered more arguments than infants, sets the child on her lap and checks the bruise with hands that know pain's geography. A neighbor with a talent for carpentry reads the axle with his fingers and says what can be mended. The man who cursed apologizes with the shame of a person who hates being seen by his own children. And the midwife answers with a psalm line cut in half, enough to be recognizable, not enough to be a performance. The water bucket completes its old work as if none of this were new. It is not new. That is the comfort. In the study hall, a visiting sage sketches a circle and writes 3 words around it: justice, mercy, humility, and asks which should face the door. A girl from the back, who has the habit of answering only when her answer is finished, lifts her hand. The door should face us, she said. The laugh that follows is the kind that lifts rather than cuts. The sage nods his head to hospitality and erases the circle. He writes, plainly, the line that has held the room together for a century of evenings. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. Then he adds, smaller, practice. The chalk breaks on the last letter, which everyone knows is a sign that an argument has landed where it was meant to land. A boy with a penchant for difficult questions approaches a judge after dusk and asks whether monotheism solved anything, or simply reduced the number of divine offices to one bureaucracy. The judge smiles the smile of someone who has been ambushed by intelligence and is happy about it. It solved the problem of who we should be, he says. When there are many gods, you can choose the patron that matches your impatience. When there is one, you must let him change you. The boy nods, dissatisfied in the proud way of youth. He will repeat the question every decade and mean it differently each time. The answer will keep shortening until it fits in a life. There are houses where the line about one is etched clean and deep, and also houses where it is scuffed by use. In one, a grandmother rubs the letters with a touch that has learned to bless by habit. In another, a man looks away from the tablet as if it were a confession he is not ready to sign and will not sign until his sons stop watching it. The city makes room for both. It has learned that correction without patience puts on righteousness like armor, and then complains that it cannot embrace anyone. So when admonitions are needed, they come tethered to invitation. Come eat, come walk. Bring your ledger to the gate at the hour when the light is honest. Storm has not retired completely to metaphor. A day of black clouds muscles over the hills and makes children excited, then solemn. The first crack of heaven's voice is a reminder that the word glory meant wait before it meant shine. Rain drills the dust back into humility and then relaxes into the steady music that keeps the world from forgetting how to grow. A man stands under a lintel he carved last year for a neighbor's door and watches the runoff choose its intelligent path. He thinks about the old sea image and laughs softly because the point has become so ordinary. Set channels that refuse to carry away what belongs to the poor. When the storm ends, he steps into the clean air with the self-satisfaction of a craftsman and the shyness of a worshiper. Letters arrive from a town that has not yet learned to love its own law. They ask for advice more than for doctrine. The reply is cautious because distance makes certainty rude. It includes 3 stories and no commands. One about a judge who waited a day before ruling and found that his anger had misremembered evidence. One about a moneylender who forgave interest after seeing the debtor's children asleep on mats. One about a priest who shortened a prayer when he noticed a stranger at the door. The letters cross paths on the road and are both opened under lamps, with the same gratitude that makes a house feel ready for weather. In a corner of the city, a small room smells like lamps and leather, and a little like onion, because life is not polite about boundaries. Here a group memorizes, not to win competition, but to have words when breath is short. A woman whose hands tremble until they hold thread repeats a psalm line until the tremble has to find another room. A boy with a stutter discovers that the old sentences have space for him to breathe. Where he chooses, he decides. For the first time, that law is not a race, but a path. An old man who once had answers enjoys, without tincture of bitterness, the freedom of being the one who asks questions that start with, "How did you learn to?" A final scene as the day tilts. A thief returns a cloak. He returns it poorly defensively, with a story about borrowing and a joke about laundry. The owner takes it with an equal lack of elegance and says only, "Next time, ask." They both know there will be a next time, because the thief steals out of worry, not malice, and the owner hoards out of memory, not greed. Across the lane, a child watching them decides that adults are simply large versions of her friends, and that the law was written by someone who understood reset. She will not remember this thought in the morning. She will live it. Which is better? Close your eyes. The city does not glow. It rests. The sentences we have followed from stones and storms to shelves and scales now lie down like well-used tools. The one, who never needed our cleverness to be himself, remains the same, maker of sky and schedule, rider of clouds and keeper of small promises, judge with slow anger and mercy that refuses to be fashionable. If sleep has room for one more line, let it be the one that has kept tents upright and cities honest. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. The rest is weather. This is how to walk through it. Evening teaches the hands to move slower, as if to remind the mind that haste is not wisdom's cousin. In a courtyard, rinsed by the day's last light, a woman oils a hinge that has been clearing its throat before every sentence. Its new quiet feels like a small blessing wrapped in metal. Nearby, a man mends a net that will never see the sea. Its job is to hold onions and patience, and finds a rhythm that keeps his temper from fraying. Children draw roads in the dust with sticks and decide that justice is when both lines reach the well. No one writes any of this down. The one does, because the ledger he keeps is measured in repairs more than in speeches. News arrives again, differently dressed. A tax revised by someone who has never paid for barley. A fashion for clever oaths that promise everything and mean a clever nothing. a theory that love of neighbor should be indexed to usefulness. The city receives these with the same protocol it uses for weather. Acknowledge. Consider. Refuse to let panic choose the policy. Elders sit where the shade is generous and read the same lines they have read in drought and in surplus. Do not swear by what you cannot carry. Do not favor the rich for fear of their frown. Leave room at the edge of your work for someone who has no coin, but also no deceit. The words are not new. Their work never seems finished. In a small workshop, a journeyman argues with his master about excellence. The journeyman wants to sign his pieces boldly. The master wants the joinery to be anonymous, as if good wood and good intent were signature enough. They split bread and argue kindly. The master quotes a proverb about the praise of strangers and the danger of believing your own. The journeyman counters with a psalm that asks the one to establish the work of our hands. They end by agreeing that excellence should be visible at arm's length and invisible at a neighbor's table strong enough to hold, quiet enough to let conversation be the loudest thing in the room. The journeyman planes the next board a shade more honest at the gate. Two women bring a problem that law anticipated and pride made complicated. A cow, bored with fences, has discovered the pleasure of visiting lentils. The owner says fences are expensive. The neighbor says lentils are not decoration. An elder, who has known both stubborn animals and stubborn days, orders a simple penance, the cow to be tethered for a season. The owner to bring a jar of oil each week to the neighbor's kitchen as apology disguised as hospitality. The neighbor smiles, only slightly sarcastic, and asks whether the cow likes mint. The court adjourns to laughter that sounds like a door opening. There are still nights when memory arrives uninvited and sits heavy. A widow cannot find sleep because the chair her husband favored is audible in its emptiness. She takes her lamp, finds the little tablet by the door with the sentence she knows, and says it not to convince herself, but to be accompanied. In the morning, a neighbor who is clumsy with words and good with wood brings a small shelf to hold her lamp a little higher, so shadows will behave. He does not call it ministry, he calls it furniture. She calls it mercy and pays him with bread he pretends is too warm to accept. A teacher in the study hall lays out the old three to write. Love mercy. Walk humbly, and allows silence to do the first tutoring. Then he rearranges the words, like stones in a river, to show how water chooses truth, no matter how you tilt it. Love mercy. A practice you can plan. Walk humbly. A posture you can rehearse. Do right. An action you cannot outsource. He assigns no reading, only a task. Find one corner in your day that has learned to neglect and return it to usefulness. A girl scrubs the threshold of her grandmother's door until welcome is visible. A boy rewrites a debt tally in larger letters so he cannot forget who has paid. The assignments return the next day as stories that make the room warmer than lamps. From a harbor town comes a troupe of speakers who sell persuasion the way others sell cloth. Tailor, flattering, expensive. They offer the city an upgrade from conscience techniques that win arguments and leave neighbors ornamented with defeat. The city listens as it listens to rain on a roof. Interested, grateful for the demonstration, unwilling to let the water in. When the show ends, a magistrate thanks them and quotes the sentence about a soft answer that turns away wrath. We prefer agreements that still let people greet each other at the well, he says. The troupe moves on, marveling at a place that treats rhetoric like weather. Enjoyable when passing, useless for building. A small boy misuses a proverb to win a game and is caught by an aunt who refuses to embarrass him. She kneels to his height and edits the line gently back into truth. Words are tools, she says, not toy. You can play with them while you learn them, but never to make another small. He grows up to be a man whose humor arrives dressed as gentleness, and people wonder how he learned to make laughter that never leaves a bruise. In the market, a sign appears over a money changer's table. Weights checked weekly with witnesses. It is both policy and performance, and everyone knows it. A woman who has never liked the money changer's grin, nonetheless brings her daughter to watch the checking, because children should see honesty done on purpose. The witnesses are chosen at random. The scale behaves. The money changer blushes at his own virtue and tells a worse joke than usual. The daughter remembers the blush more than the joke and grows into someone who trusts systems that can be seen when they are working. Storm comes late one afternoon like a drummer testing a room. The first drops enlarge the dust into dark coins. Then the sky remembers its vocation and spends itself. In the sudden quiet between thunderclaps, a craftsman steps under the eaves of the gate he repaired last winter and listens for the groan that used to give away weakness. The wood holds. He does not congratulate himself. He thanks the one who taught men to read grain and to resist the shortcut that always promises to be good enough. When the rain passes, the city smells like honesty, rinsed and served again. A letter arrives, folded carefully, from a village that learned the sentence late and is still clumsy with it. They confess to looking at the sentence as if it were a charm instead of a chore. They say it and wait for their enemies to become polite. The reply is short and kind. Do right first where you have least to gain. It says, love mercy where it will not be seen. Walk humbly where you would prefer to pose. The sentence changes. Rooms after it changes, walkers. The letter is read aloud 3 times in the square, then hung near the well, where water and advice both have an audience. In a narrow alley lives a scribe who fixes letters the way a midwife fixes breath. People bring him torn contracts and smudged prayers, and he returns them legible with a smile that costs nothing. One evening, a man brings him a name etched on wood, his own that wine and regret have made crooked. Can you straighten this? The man asks, not joking. The scribe looks at the grain, at the knife, at the man. Not tonight, he said. Tomorrow, if you bring me your neighbor and the coin you owe him. The man returns the next day with both. The name is recut, the coin counted. The neighbor surprised into forgiveness that feels premature and is therefore perfect. The scribe charges nothing and sleeps as if paid. A child asks an old question with new urgency. How do we know the one still listens when the world is loud? A grandmother answers by refusing philosophy. She points to her palm. When you were small and cried, she says, I heard you, even when bread was burning, and the goat was untying himself. Not because your cry was loudest, but because it was yours. The child nodded, unconvinced but comforted, which is the correct order for certain ages. That night, lying awake, the child repeats the sentence about one like counting swifts, and is asleep by the time humility arrives. At a feast, after wine has taught words to walk more easily, an elder tries to confess a failure as entertainment and finds that the room will not permit it. Tell it plain, someone said. Without the cushion, he does, and silence holds for the shape of a breath, then becomes blessing. They eat a little more carefully after that, as if knives could teach sorrow to be useful. Near the city's edge, a small field has been left wild on purpose. Children are taken there when logic has made their heads ring. A teacher walks them among the unstraight lines and asks them to name what mercy looks like when it grows without plan. They point, a thistle feeding a bird that cannot pay. A path widened by feet that were not scolded. A patch left unharvested that looks like waste, until you measure it with kindness. The children return to their sums rearranged. On the way back, one of them, with the solemnity that only 9-year-olds and judges possess, decides to stop pocketing apricots for later. He eats one now and shares the other, which is how justice begins. A final small moment before sleep. A father who was not taught to apologize when he was young sits on a low wall and rehearses a sentence. He will say to his daughter, he wants it to be exact without being grand. He plans to include the words, I was wrong, and to exclude the words, but understand. He practices twice, then stop, because practice is turning apology into performance. He goes inside and says it once, imperfectly, and his daughter, who has been waiting to be asked to forgive without being instructed to, doesn't. The room grows larger by a unit of air that no one can see, but everyone breathes. The little tablet by the door is not consulted. It is assumed, close your eye. The errands have ended for now. The holiness they became lingers like warmth where hands rested. The sentence keeps its watch at thresholds and in ledgers, in kitchens and court, in the pause before harsher words and the choice of gentler one. Say the name, not to summon weather, but to remember grammar. One who hears, one who steadies, one who judges without purchase and prefers repair to theater. Then say the line that has walked with us from storm to schedule. Do right, love mercy. Walk humbly. The rest, as always, will be weather, and you, as always, will know how to walk in it. The city learns to measure time, not only by moons and markets, but by repairs completed. At the start of a new season, people bring out ledgers that have learned to tell the truth, and they read them as if they were psalms. This debt shortened. That quarrel laid flat. These corners of fields left honest and green. A scribe whose ink has always tried to look braver than his heart copies a line about justice rolling like water and mercy like a river that does not ask to be paid. He pauses, because he can hear it in canals cleared last week, in gossip that has forgotten a name, in scales that blink level even when no one stands near. The old mountain once taught thunder to speak grammar. Now neighborhoods teach grammar to speak kindness until the words remember how they began. A rumor crosses rooftops that a visiting official wants theater. He likes the sound of crowds bending to shout a slogan shaped like him. The market hears and continues being market. The benches hear and continue being benches that refuse to tilt. When he arrives, he is met with bread rather than applause, with a hall that smells like oil and patience rather than perfume. He asks for a parade. He is offered a reading law first, then a psalm, then a set of cases settled without flattery. He watches as a widow's boundary stone is restored to its rightful stubbornness, as a moneylender returns interest that fear had signed without his knowledge, as an apprentice admits a mistake before his master finds it. By afternoon he has learned that this place will not perform dignity, it will practice it, and he leaves with the odd relief of someone spared the exhaustion of being pleased for a living. Children grow taller, questions grow more precise. In the study house, a teacher lays the old sentence on the table like bread and asks the room to tear what each can carry. Do right, he says, and a girl asks whether right means rule or result. He answers with a small story about a judge who took a breath and let his anger age into accuracy. Love mercy, he continues, and a boy asks what to do when mercy is mistaken for weakness. The teacher tells him to love mercy anyway, and to befriend patience so that people live long enough to notice the difference. Walk humbly, he finishes, and the room grows quiet, because humility is a verb that takes practice and no witnesses. When class ends, the children forget their sandals at the door and remember their assignments by supper. Workshops become chapels without changing their furniture. A mason tunes his hammer until the stone answers in a lower, more trustworthy voice. He is not pursuing art, he is keeping faith. A weaver whose hands can count threads faster than words, can count reasons, leaves a flaw where it will be invisible to customers, but visible to God. Not as superstition, but as a reminder that perfection is an appetite that, left unfed, makes room for kindness. A vintner siphons off the last cloudy measure from a jar and sends it to a neighbor whose year has been slow. She writes no note and receives one anyway. A proverb about generous souls being watered like fields after rain. Evening lessons move from benches to doorways as heat withdraws from the day. An old man, once a boy, who lit charcoal at the hill, where wet wood burned, sits with grandchildren who want weather. He gives them weather, but he teaches them to hear it properly. Fire taught us where to bend, he says. Now water teaches us how to care it. A city is a vessel. The one pours justice, mercy, and asks whether we leak. The children, who understand vessels because they break them, nod solemnly and promise to test for leaks in the morning. The old man laughs and hopes they never stop making such vows out loud. There a stumble, as there must be. A judge accepts hospitality that comes packaged with a favorable memory. He does not notice the string attached until he trips. He recuses himself with a statement that sounds like a confession and is, the city does not throw stones. It lengthens the benches, because more judges will need them one day. A priest lets ceremony stand in for conscience and is caught by silence that will not be hurried. He shortens the liturgy rather than his shame and spends a season carrying water to houses where grief lives. A merchant, tempted by a caravan's urgency, adds weight to noon and subtracts it in shadow. He is confronted not with outrage, but with an offer to stand beside the scale each market morning until habit relearns honesty. He accepts. By the third day, his face has forgotten how to look defended. Storm returns with a pedagogy the city trusts. Clouds gather like deliberation. Wind voices the kind of argument that ends with agreement. When the first hard rain coins the dust into dark circles, a boy remembers the proverb about God's voice over waters and decides not to answer his brother with the cleverness that would win and wound. The gutters keep their appointments. A carpenter stands under an eave and listens for rot, hearing none. He thanks the one for the old command against shortcuts. Rain becomes commentary on law. Thunder becomes punctuation for humility. When the sun insists on its turn, leaves glitter with the kind of forgiveness only weather can stay. Travelers keep finding their way here and keep being surprised, not by magnificence, but by decency that does not ask to be noticed. A scholar trained in elegance listens to law read in the square and expects performance. She finds procedure. She spends a week following a scribe who edits contracts as if he were tidying altars and leaves with a new affection for margins, the places where corrections are made without spectacle. A sailor with a mouth that learned its words in storms watches a money changer refuse to profit from panic and discovers that courage is not a sailor's monopoly. He carries the discovery home like an extra rope that will save a deckhand when the sea decides to instruct. The city keeps its humor because humor is mercy wearing wit. A sign appears over a booth. Fair waits. Fair word. It is too good not to be true. A baker bakes a small loaf that looks like a tablet and writes the sentence in sesame. Children memorize with butter and crumbs. A judge quotes a proverb in a tone that has seen too much to be scolding and not enough to be tired. The courtroom laughs and then obeys. A grandmother, observing pride colonize a grandson's posture, assigns him 3 days of quiet errands for widows with the explanation. A spine straightens better when it remembers what it carries. He returns taller, which is the point. There are letters, always letters, from a distant town. Our neighbors do not keep Sabbath. Business finds us open when we would rest. The reply, close anyway. Let your prophet follow your peace like a dog that has learned its place. From a village afraid of strangers, we have heard story. The reply, feed them, then decide what to fear. From a scholar tangled in certainties. How much must I know before I can say the name without presumption? The reply, say it while doing right. Knowledge will introduce itself along the way. The letters are copied and kept, not as law, but as the kind of counsel that keeps roofs from forgetting why they were built. A festival arrives, as faithful to its month as the moon. The city dresses in light without pretending to be new. Stories are told with the edges softened and the lessons sharpened. We were slaves, the room says together, to save the proud from becoming boring. We were led out, the room says together, to save the grateful from becoming sentimental. A child asks whether the sea still needs to be split. A mother answers that it is split every day when men choose law over advantage and women choose mercy over memory's pleasure. The child is not impressed. He will be later, when his own advantage grows teeth. Nightfall, the gatekeepers lean their backs against wood that remembers siege and peace with equal patience. In houses, lamps are pinched into calm, not darkness. A father who has kept his temper 3 days in a row without applause tells no one. He sleeps the sleep of someone whose heart has learned to enjoy obedience. A woman whose grief has faded from shout to hymn sets bread for morning and does not apologize for the joy that arrives unannounced. A boy who once argued for sport learns to keep questions that wound for mornings when everyone is stronger. The little tablet by the door, worn smooth by thousands of small fidelities, keeps its sentence without needing oil. Before sleep fully claims the city, a small scene makes a parable without asking permission. A thief more frightened than wicked returns a borrowed tool at the wrong hour. The owner opens, frowns, listens, sets the tool aside, and hands over bread. Come tomorrow at light, he says, and we will mend what fear broke. The thief nods, confused by being answered in a language his panic does not speak. He walks home holding bread like a promise he has not deserved yet, and wonders, as men do on such nights, whether God prefers repair because it keeps more people employed. Close your eye. The sentence is still enough to steer by short, unglamorous, durable as a cord that has learned many knots. The storm still knows how to teach. The law still knows how to sing. Conscience still knows how to recognize its own voice. Habit still knows how to turn belief into weather others can live under. Say the name. As one says here, when a roll is called and presence matters, let breath answer with the line that remains our road and our rest. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. Even the best stories must learn how to land. Ours descends the way evening does without hurry, touching every roof the same. The city that once needed thunder to point the way now keeps its direction by smaller lights. A father who returns what wasn't his with no speech attached. A magistrate who admits a mistake while the court is still full. A girl who moves a stone back to where it belonged and doesn't tell the story afterward. The old titles still live in the air: cloud riding, sea treader, but they sound like nicknames between friends, not slogans for rallies. When children ask what they mean, the elders point to schedules, to scale, to doors left unlatched on nights when kindness expects a guest. One last storm visits for memory's sake, coming in on legs of gray and leaving everything rinsed. People stand beneath lintels and feel the voice over the waters turn into a permission they recognize. You may be clean again. It does not make us new. It makes us honest. The gutters keep their covenant. The fields receive without greed. The roofs report that their joinery still remembers its vows. When the cloud's hem lifts, the city smells like mercy on. A prophet is not needed to translate. Everyone understands. At daybreak, a boy who will be old one day finds his palm lying of its own accord on the little tablet by the door. He says the first line, the one about hearing and want, and notices with a start he will forget by lunch that the sentence feels like home rather than like homework. His mother ties a cord on his wrist to remind him to tell the truth, even when he could be clever. She does not call this religion. She calls it love refusing to be lazy. A traveler asks, as travelers must, whether the one ever got smaller by walking into kitchens. The answer is a story set at a table. Two neighbors who used to negotiate their decency like traders now pass bread without counting. The traveler nods and says something kind about philosophy. It's not philosophy. One neighbor replies with a smile that has learned its own volume. It's whether we can carry inside. A scribe, finishing a lifetime of tidy margin, copies a last line in a hand steadier than his bone. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. He sets down the pen and looks out over a street that has practiced those words until the flagstones remember the steps. He thinks of mountains and councils and seas and storms, and how the name traveled through all of them like a sentence hunting its object. He whispers the name and feels the room answer not with spectacle, but with company. Night comes the way a promise keeps itself. Gates lean shut, lamps narrow. The city exhales into trust. Somewhere a widow sleeps with the window open because the hinge no longer complains. Somewhere a judge dreams of a bench that is simply a bench, not a throne. Somewhere a child, frowning in sleep, relaxes when a line about one finds the place under worry. Where lullabies do their truest work, the storm, satisfied with what it taught, stands a little farther off. The sea consents to be a boundary, not a threat. Angels run their quiet errands and forget, on purpose, to be noticed. If you need an ending, take this one. A people once asked for fire and got a law, asked for victory and got a conscience, asked for a king and got a name they could carry into markets and marriages and mournings. The God who may have been met first at the edge of storm grew, or rather revealed, into the one who measures holiness by repaired thresholds and debts forgiven on ordinary Tuesdays. He did not stop being the weather's God. He became also the grammar of goodness, short enough to memorize, large enough to live inside. Close your eye. Say the name, the way you answer when someone you love calls from another room. Then let the old sentence settle over the day you have had and the one coming to meet you. Do right, love mercy, walk humbly. The rest will be weather. You know what to do.